And welcome everyone to another edition of History After Dark. Tonight we're discussing the lurid details of the James Buchanan presidency. Buchanan, of course, was elected in 1856, and most historians, if not quite all, do consider him to be the absolute worst president in American history. And so to discuss his presidency with its many controversies, I've assembled a panel. We have Michael Kraemer, we have Sean Chick, we have Monica Shepard. So, welcome everyone. How's it going?
It's going good.
Yeah, it's great. Thanks for letting me kind of drop into the stream at the last second.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess to be fair, I did, give you belay status, so technically you could jump in anytime you want.
Unannounced.
I want to have a very good way to deal with it. Very good defense for that. So, all right.
Yeah.
So I just besides finishing the Buchanan book, did some edits for a volume 1 for the Petersburg campaign, and we do have the GoFundMe in the thing, right? In the description.
Yeah, I have it up on the screen too right now. It's
excellent.
Tab,
all right,
so.
Good. Yeah, just mention everybody. I am I launched GoFundMe. I haven't raised as much money right now because I did a lot of tours and I had to edit this book. But I'm going to be really ramping up trying to raise money for it now. So, it's Civil War related. So, that's in the description. And anybody who does, put your name in the book for Volume 3 to show that you helped out.
Yeah. So this is the fundraising page. I'll also link that in the chat, and then I'll put it in the description later.
Excellent, man.
So if you want to go visit it, you can click right there. All right. So I guess even though he wasn't president for super long, we need to get into his controversies relatively quickly. So how much background do we want to get into with Buchanan before we jump into him being president?
I think I wrote quite a few notes in his background, and I know we don't want to, we have got a lot of people here and don't want to be here forever necessarily, but I think it's very important. And one of the reasons I have a lot of notes is because this man has one of the longest political careers of his era.
Yes, yeah. I mean, he was a major player in a few different presidencies.
Yes,
qualified.
Yes. I mean, when he's born, George Washington's alive, for instance.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, like, he might have one of, if not the best resumes of an incoming president.
Yeah.
Yes, although it is notable that he had no executive experience.
True.
Mostly a lot of foreign policy, mostly a lot of foreign stuff. But anyways, so if y'all want to, let me see, how many pages do I have on his background?
Well, we can start, from a little bit about his background.
Yeah. So, fun fact, actually is born in a log cabin. On the Pennsylvania, but keeping in mind, not born into any kind of poverty necessarily. All right, he was born in a log cabin because, he was they were kind of close to what was sort of the Pennsylvania frontier at the time, and not exactly frontier, but like backwoods area. So actually born in a log cabin. His father was known for being a very, how shall we say, kind of a depressed character in some ways. He would oftentimes tell his son that, whenever good news happens, expect bad to follow. And he was really inspired by his mother, who used to keep him up telling him tales of great men. Well, oh, by the way, he had no middle name. Fun fact. So, he eventually attends Dickinson College, where he's comically enough is involved in a school rebellion. This, by the way, was kind of a feature in the early 19th century. There was one at University of Virginia when it opened up, which Thomas Jefferson called one of the saddest days of his life. If you want to read about that, when Jefferson actually went there and personally rebuked the students. And the best one of all, though, is the Eggnog Rebellion, of which Jefferson Davis was involved in at West Point. So that was just a thing that was going on. It was a rowdy time. But that being said, Buchanan himself was known as a decent talker, but not particularly charismatic. And not a bad speaker, but rather kind of grim, known for a lack of humor. People comment throughout his life that he was one of the least funny men they'd ever met.
Yeah, apparently people who visited his house would comment that he also lacked any books that were fun. It was all law books and really dry stuff.
He struggled with social interactions for sure.
Yes. The other thing, though, too, keep in mind is, interestingly enough, though, he did like cigars and wine. And he would actually later be known for being a pretty good host overall for parties and things. So people liked visiting with him in that regard. But it's kind of odd. He wasn't good singer. He's a good talker. He's intelligent. He could host a decent enough party, but he always seemed to be distant from other people. But at the same time, they rely a lot on friends. But that's got to do with him being a bachelor. But before I get to the bachelor part, it is worth noting that, guess what? This guy was a Federalist at first.
Yeah, that was wild to find out. I was like, what?
Yeah, I knew that. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, well, definitely some of his political opinions changed over time, but he also was he's kind of one of the reasons why the Federalist Party in Pennsylvania survives a few years longer than it does elsewhere, because they were like, oh, this young talent came and went in there, and he is a veteran of the War of 1812. Joined the militia unit and was sent to go procure horses. Now I say veteran; he wasn't shot at, but he did serve in the War of 1812. I was surprised about that one too.
And I want to just add some background. He's elected as a Federalist in 1812, 1813. Like, the Federalist Party is on its death knells when he's first elected on that party label, which is kind of wild.
Even wilder, he runs as a Federalist in 1820 when they're really dead.
Yeah, right? I mean...
So that also shows another attribute of Buchanan was stubbornness and willfulness. There is a whole lot of controversy about him in regards to him being a bachelor. And what happened there was, this is worth mentioning because he is our only bachelor president, which is going to lead to a whole bunch of other things as well. Let me see here 1 second. Anyways, wait. All right. So he was engaged to an Ann Coleman, and by this time, he's around 18. This is after the War of 1812. Remember, he's an up-and-coming lawyer and politician. And this engagement collapses dramatically. Now, why it does, you'll have all sorts of accusations. Of course, one that's followed Buchanan his entire life is that he's gay. I'm not going to dive so much into that one. They got YouTube videos. I'll do that for you, all right? But that being said, there was also accusations that he had a brief affair with a woman in another town. It was also known that Buchanan was a workaholic, and that Ann Coleman did not like that, felt that she was being ignored, And another one, the one that seems to have really set it off, was that when he returned home, he met with another woman before meeting her, and that's when she said, "This is off." Then she dies what was pronounced hysterical convulsions. We don't know what that means, but there was also implications that actually it was suicide. So when Buchanan, asks to see the body, to be part of the funeral procession, her father essentially says, "If you show up, I'll shoot you." So this greatly affected him. And it's not that he never considered marriage again. I actually read that he did consider it many years later, but he didn't really. He thought it would be kind of ridiculous for him to marry at the age that he was, somebody who was 20 years younger than him. All letters show that this really did rip him to pieces personally. And it's notable that after that, he redoubles himself into work. And he is going to be spending essentially 50 years with almost no pause in politics. 50 years. Do you all have any comments on the bachelor part?
Not too much. I mean, I know that I think he might have briefly dated a couple other people later in his
Yeah.
career, but it never went anywhere. And like you were saying, he said that it would be ridiculous to get married in his older age because he basically said he was no longer physically capable of sex, and so he thought it would be a boring marriage and his wife would just be a caretaker. So
Yeah, exactly, like a nurse. There's a lot of evidence that he probably had low testosterone because he couldn't grow a beard, and he's also because he couldn't grow a beard and his hairline. Also, it should be noted that there is just about no record of any dalliances of almost no dalliances of any kind later in his life, and very few serious considerations. Yeah, and this a lot of people commented that after this he became a colder man, but at the same time he has to rely on his friends a lot. Okay, and this plays a big part in his administration because he was constantly hanging out with the cabinet. He held what are considered some of the longest cabinet meetings of all time. And after those cabinet meetings are done, he would be like he'd go hang out with them. In particular Howell Cobb. Who's going to stab him in the back later. He also writes in third person after this.
interesting.
Which is always amusing.
Says a lot about his personality.
Yeah, he also failed to establish a nickname for himself, really, which I guess was unusual in this period.
Well, he did have a nickname. He had
a few, but none of them were, prominent.
Yeah, the one that I ran to the most was the Squire.
Really? Okay, I didn't see that one. I saw 10 cents a day Jimmy.
Yeah, so I was going to say that.
Old
Buck and then Old Public Functionary.
Old Buck, there you go. The Squire was the one he was called by his, to be fair, the Squire is what he's called by his cabinet.
Okay.
And the people in Congress as well. So probably more just like a personal nickname. What do you think that says about his personality, Monica?
What, the fact that his nickname?
No, just the third person and all the other stuff.
Well, he thought very highly of himself, I would say.
Probably so, right? I was actually found out that Winfield Scott, when he wrote his account of of his campaign against Mexico City, he also wrote in the third person.
Winfield, all fuss and feathers.
Old fuss and feathers, man. Everybody who met Scott would be like, God, talented general, but man, that guy's really into himself.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Winfield Scott was like the Zap Brannigan of this period.
Yeah. Right. And think about it, 1820, he's becoming a prominent politician, and then his father dies. And one of Buchanan's first reactions apparently was to say, well, my father always told me loss usually follows success. Yeah. So, and in 1824, he is essentially more allied to Andrew Jackson, but during the controversy over that between Andrew Jackson, Henry Clay, and John Quincy Adams, Buchanan actually plays each side fairly well, although Jackson felt a bit betrayed, and will describe Buchanan as inept and cowardly. Yeah. And this is also around the time that his closeness with Southerners begins, which begins with William King of Alabama, who had the nickname Aunt Fancy, and the pair of them became known as Buchanan and his wife. This is where most of the rumors of him being gay come from. That and the fact that he was also close to John Randolph of Roanoke. So in many ways took on King's views. While in the House of Representatives, he was not considered a very good speaker. He was, by the way, punchline for Henry Clay. And what you find with him is that he wasn't a poor speaker by any means. But his thing was that he was never good at quips or anything. He became a better speaker as time went on. But he was good at things that were like lawyerly speeches. The Senate actually was where he excelled the most with this. The House of Representatives being a little more rough and tumble, he wasn't as well suited to it. And he then wanted to go into private life, but then was sent to Russia and becomes minister there. He's able to set up a commercial treaty, but he did not like Russia very much, commenting that he didn't like the secrecy, serfdom, or the spies.
And I wanted to add here about the sort of Russian context, because he serves as minister to Russia, just like I think it's about a decade, like early into Nicholas I's rule. And Nicholas I is known as a particularly micromanagey czar who very much sort of sets up the sort of classic authoritarian system of the Russian Empire, like what we sort of stereotypically imagine like old imperial Russia as. Nicholas I sort of sets up that system. Interesting thing to know: the Tsarist Empire crushes a Polish rebellion, very prominent Polish rebellion in 1830. Buchanan gives a speech I think in the House of Representatives, where basically he gives a speech condemning Russia for this. Ends up then as minister to Russia by 1832. So, he responds the way an average sort of American politician at this time would respond to Russia. Like, this is despotism, right?
Yes,
this is, he responds, I don't know. And in this sense, James Buchanan is almost very reflective of other Americans' views of Russia at the time.
Very. And also, that reminds me of that, the famous letter where Lincoln says, I'll go to Russia, where, what does he say? Where despotism can be taken pure and without the base alloy of hypocrisy.
Exactly. Yeah.
This one thing in Russia though, he did get a commercial treaty with Russia.
Yeah.
So score that one. Mm-hmm. He fails to get another treaty going in part, it seems, from British interference. And Buchanan is going to be one of our many Anglophobic presidents. Which makes saying him to Britain even funnier in the 1850s. Oh, yeah, the whole treaty with Britain that avoids a war over Maine. Yeah, he was opposed to that. He was ready for war. Oh, yeah, no, Buchanan's surprisingly very bellicose, but we'll get to that a bit later. Was that then, too? 1833, he returns, loses, but then 1834 is appointed to the Senate. And is this time very closely allied to Martin Van Buren. He will oppose the gag rule that was put in to prevent discussion of slavery in Congress.
Wow.
Yeah. The thing about Buchanan, from what I can read about his ideas on slavery, comes from one, he has, this very lonely man becomes friends with one of the most prominent Southern politicians, that being King, and is closely allied to him, and that gets him connected with other Southern politicians. And he is absolutely 100% terrified of slave rebellions.
Yes.
So that really does motivate a lot of his actions in regards to slavery. So at any rate, though, let me see. Oh, and it's around this time he actually does become. He does start. He hosts like an annual ball in Congress. In Washington every year. That was very popular. So this time, this is. It probably helps the fact that he likes wine and cigars. Wouldn't you say?
I would.
Oh yeah. In fact, I read several accounts where the guy was like, "Yeah, I'm going to go meet Buchanan." Found him rolling a cigar.
Yeah, I guess too, one of his big strategies in Washington was he liked to point out to people that he's from Pennsylvania and that Pennsylvania had his electoral weight. So he very much used that to great effect. So he not only went to John Dickinson College, he basically borrowed John Dickinson's political strategy.
Yes. And no doubt about it, he does. He's integral to Pennsylvania politics almost to the very end. And the Senate really does suit him. He does exceptionally well in the Senate because in the Senate, less rough and tumble. The kind of speaking that he is good at is the kind of speaking you're going to hear in the Senate. So in some ways, I think the Senate might be the happiest time of his life, really. You know, so he should be kept in mind, a hardcore expansionist. He once declared, "We must fulfill our destiny," which is why you oppose which is also why he opposes the Webster Ashburton Treaty. So think about it. He was like, "No, let's go get Canada." And he wants, and when they're discussing how much of Texas and Oregon should we get, he says all of both.
Oh my gosh.
Yes.
Oh yeah, I know. It's for a man who is portrayed as was essentially trying to avoid civil war, and is portrayed as as being like maybe and in a lot of social situations he could be very cautious and halting. Man, this guy sure likes getting into conflict. I mean, he even during his presidency would talk about maybe we should take all of Mexico too.
Mm-hmm. Several accounts called him obsessed with expansion, by the way.
Yes.
Apparently he made James K. Polk uncomfortable because of how hardcore he was at Manifest Destiny.
Right.
There's also going to be some confusion during the Polk presidency. Now, in the case of he campaigns very hard for Polk. He is a very loyal party man, which I think is one of the biggest things that's going to undermine his administration. And when he's made Secretary of State, he gradually is not that happy with it as time goes on. He actually wanted to be put on the Supreme Court. He preferred that, but Polk says, "I want him the Secretary of State." Let me see what happens here. Okay, so we're talking about him being an expansionist. In the case of his relationship with Polk found him a loyal and a hard worker, but at times indecisive and brooding. And called him an old maid without agent, and an old maid, and believed that he lacked judgment. So both men started with a decent working relationship that decays over time. Okay.
Calling a man an old maid at that time, he was basically calling him a sissy.
Yes. And also coming from Polk, I mean, and keep in mind, that's what Andrew Jackson thought of him as well. Right?
Called him Nancy.
Polk is Jackson's protege. Buchanan thought Polk was a hard worker. He admired that a lot, but thought that he wasn't particularly smart. And one of the things that frustrated Polk was that when the Mexican War starts, Polk essentially. Oh wait, I forgot to do. Sorry, buddy. Want to turn the phone off? Forgot to do that. All right, done.
That's fine.
Okay. So what happens with Polk is that at first Buchanan didn't want as expansionist of goals. But as the war goes on, as more lives are lost, as it racks up more expenses, and because of the Mexico City campaign, suddenly Buchanan's like, no, we should take more territory. Polk did not like that, and it can be said that Buchanan in many ways flubbed the peace process with Mexico.
So I just want to mention, I wonder about Buchanan and his friends and who he's talking to. There's this great book called This Vast Southern Empire by Matthew Karp that talks about pro-slavery Southerners effectively controlling the sort of foreign offices. And if he's in that milieu, that might be why that he is becoming more and more sort of pro-slavery and more expansionistic over the 40s and the 50s. Because those are his friends. Those are the people he's talking to in these parties and stuff like that.
Well, in particular, John Slidell's a big one.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, John Slidell shows up a bunch.
Well, there's also, I guess, the possibility that if they do seize Cuba and these other places that are on Buchanan's wish list, then those are slave areas, and then that helps to balance out the fact that a lot of the incoming states in the West will probably be free, and then that maintains the balance. So it looks like Buchanan's solution to the problem is just more expansion will solve everything.
Oh, absolutely.
Especially Cuba's sugar plantations.
Exactly.
And I would say it's not just about maintaining balance; it's about breaking the balance in the favor of the South, right?
Yeah, because you would
Like,
definitely have a lot more humanity coming in from those areas than you would from, the plains.
yeah,
Mhm.
He's
well, they
a, he's
can't
a
even.
firm believer in the compromise, in the Missouri Compromise. All
Oh,
right.
yes.
Yeah, this is going to play a big part in how he carries things on later. He also believed that slavery should not be broached because it would destroy the Union.
Mhm.
And I know we're saying that, but Buchanan is actually one of the ones saying it more strenuously earlier than some of these other guys. So that should be noted that the idea that slavery could destroy the Union was very much on his mind for decades. So keep that in mind as well. Let me see right here, checking something, but Slidell, for instance, we mentioned him. This is one of the scummiest politicians of this era.
Is that
Um, wait, say again?
one of?
Well, yeah, no. People at this time think he's scummy. So it's a kind of like like Benjamin Butler and Simon Cameron, where you're like, wait, if they think you're corrupt back then, you must be really corrupt.
Mhm.
Slidell was known for he was a Louisiana senator, and he had a great trick around here. So he would have steamboats go to Plaquemines Parish, and after his people voted in Plaquemines, they would then bring them to Orleans Parish, and the steamboat would bring them to Jefferson Parish. He was really good at making sure he got multiple votes out of people in Louisiana. All right. Um, oh yeah, and Polk, for instance, started off also liking Slidell, and then gradually turning against him as well. Buchanan, to which this is going to Slidell's going to backstab him as well, will remain friends with Slidell almost to the eve of the war. Let me see something here. Okay, so I've got that massive book open with like a few pages, but I don't really see that. Okay, so anyway, I'm going to move right along here. Let's see what we got next. Okay. Um, should be kept in mind, though, that he is also a thoroughgoing Anglophobe as well. So
Mm.
expansion, while he's going to favor more southern expansion, remember he wants all of Oregon as well. Now
Yeah.
Polk is the one who's going to shoot that down. All right. One interesting thing as Secretary of State, he puts pressure on Brazil to observe the ban on the slave trade. Yeah. Oh, I forgot to mention this about him personally. By the time you get to him as Secretary of State, he is not a formal member of any church, and he is taking care of 7 orphans in his family.
Mhm.
And he's locally popular due to his philanthropy as well.
Huh.
You know, so those things kept in mind as well. Even though he's a bachelor, he is supporting a lot of members of his very large extended family.
Yeah, he also has a lot of
Right.
nephews he has to find patronage jobs for.
Oh yeah. Oh, another one. No. Oh, fun thing. I also found out a little statistic going back to the bachelor thing. The rate of being a bachelor in this era is roughly only 3 men out of 100.
Whew.
Damn, I didn't
Yeah.
realize it was that low.
I'm not surprised at all. Like almost everybody I read about in this era is married, so he really stands out for that reason.
So that's not just
Um,
major public figures, it's just the whole population, only 3 out of 100.
mhm.
Damn.
Yeah.
Okay.
Before vote for men, that is. Uh, by this time in Pennsylvania politics, his rivals are Simon Cameron and Wilmot of the Wilmot Proviso. Do you guys have any notes on Cameron or Wilmot? You mentioned Cameron earlier because he's another one of the most corrupt politicians of the era. Apparently, he's the one who first said, "An honest politician is one who, when bought, stays bought."
Mm.
Yeah.
I mean,
Pretty valid today.
Yeah.
The Undertaker's now running the Department of Education.
So
Or,
Wait,
I thought it was Lyndon
Franklin
McMahon.
Pierce. Oh, the Undertaker? Hell yeah, man, the Undertaker. What, I'm not a wrestling fan. So, anyways, what's gonna happen next is let me see. He was then made minister to Britain by Franklin Pierce. Odd choice for an out-and-out Anglophobe, don't you think? who earlier was saber rattling about Oregon. Yeah, hey, guess who works as a secretary, Derek?
Who's that?
Dan Sickles.
What?
The great Dan Sickles.
Well, I guess their policies
Serial
are pretty
killer?
compatible, though, right? I mean, because Dan
Oh,
Sickles
no,
was
they
also a Northern War Democrat.
no. Sickles and Buchanan got along very well, even though the fact that when Sickles shows up in Britain to serve as a secretary, he doesn't bring his pregnant wife, he brings his mistress.
And Buchanan knows about this, or
Oh, yeah, no, it's not a secret, you know?
yeah, I guess that's true. Sickles is not the kind of guy to keep something like that secret. He'd just say, "Oh, by the way, yeah, my mistress will be staying over there too, so get her a room."
Another thing that's interesting about this is that despite all of this, he got along very well with the foreign secretary for Britain at the time, named Clarendon.
Huh.
Even though Clarendon and him had their disagreements, and in particular, Clarendon at one point called him proud as Lucifer. But the thing about Buchanan when he's with Britain, when he's minister to Britain, it's not really that successful. There was the British had some apparently had sent people into Central America.
Yeah.
And Buchanan was saying, you can't do this. And at one point, Buchanan mentioned this obscure geographic place in Central America and said, this is the Gibraltar of the area. And Clarendon embarrassed him and said, I don't even know what you're talking about. Because at this time, what's going on, everybody? The Crimean War. I think that's more on his mind. But what's interesting about his time at Clarendon is they did actually overall get along well. And remember, Buchanan is a lonely man who leans a lot on the friends that he does have. He considered Clarendon a bit of a friend. They used to have very long meetings. It was noted that Buchanan was essentially hanging out in Clarendon's office because he had no place else to go.
Oh.
And also, by the way, he made a mistake at one point where he did not very much is one of these believers in Republican simplicity. So even though Buchanan was fairly well off, he didn't dress ostentatiously. So when he first showed up to, I think it was a ball or a party, he was mistaken for a servant. This caused great embarrassment. So Buchanan, to make sure that everybody knew that he was an ambassador, he had a sword that he would wear, so nobody would mistake him for a servant, because he refused to wear garish or outlandish clothing. And then you get the Ostend Manifesto. What would you like to say? Anybody want to comment on that one? I actually didn't make as many notes in the Ostend Manifesto.
Yeah, I don't
All right, well,
recall the details.
Nobody's got that one? Yeah, okay,
I
guys.
had something about it, but I don't. It's like
Sean, that wasn't that important to me. Yeah.
Wasn't that important to you? Come on, man.
We haven't even gotten to his presidency yet, Sean. So you're taking care of the pre-presidency stuff, and I'll jump in on diplomacy. But
gotcha.
Go for it.
Ostend Manifesto, in short, is one of these things that does help inflame sectional tension at this time.
Yeah.
Because it's a manifesto of him essentially saying, like, yeah, we want to take, I believe it was Cuba. Point is that this is once again Buchanan with this aggressive foreign policy.
Yeah, so here's the thing I found. So 1854, it was published anonymously, but it urged the Pierce administration to offer $100 million in return for Cuba, because without Cuba, the U.S. can never be secure. If Spain says no, we should go to war and just seize it. So this was effectively saying, let's give Spain an ultimatum. Let's give an ultimatum to, I guess, what most people in the world at that point would consider to be a much more powerful nation. Give them a manifesto, and then, or not a manifesto, give them an ultimatum and threaten them into a war.
Mm-hmm. Well,
wow.
And now you're going to get the election of 1856.
I was just going to say, connected to the Ostend Manifesto, that I sort of forgot about. You know, all those like filibuster campaigns.
William Walker.
Yeah, it's started by that same group of people, sort of influencing Buchanan on the Ostend Manifesto and stuff. And they're even getting Buchanan at the time apparently is getting solicitations from people who say, "Hey, fund me, and I'll go down and bring slavery to Central America. Then you can get a new state."
Yeah, and you keep it in mind too. This idea of like getting Cuba. God, was it Cuba? I mean, Grant tried to get an island in the Caribbean as well, and then he got
That was
scuttled.
Cuba.
It was Cuba
Yeah,
again. Yeah, he
Cuba.
got scuttled
Yeah.
by my favorite abolitionist, Charles Sumner.
Yeah. There are a lot of people in the U.S., especially nationalists, who are kind of obsessed with expanding to Cuba around this time.
Yes,
I think there's one historian who even kind of makes the argument that like this obsession with Cuba almost leads to a bunch of sort of escalations that lead to the Civil War. I think it goes too far in that argument, but it's an interesting one.
I would also say that in that case, 1898 is America finally going, well, damn it, we're finally here.
Yeah.
And then the
Yeah,
Bay of Pigs
right.
is just, I mean, the Bay of Pigs, I guess, in that sense, is very predictable.
Well, they give it up. They give it up in 1898 to kind of America's credit. There you go.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, Cuba's not a puppet afterwards or anything.
I mean, technicalities. They could have gone farther, man. Just saying. Anyway,
we're still in Cuba. We got to get to Guantanamo Bay. What the hell are we saying?
Yeah.
You know, we are in Cuba. So, anyways, 1856 election.
Yeah.
Buchanan finally runs a good nomination fight. Does very well there. At this point, he's very popular in the party because he had not really said much about the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and he also, by the way, his supporters have one of the most fun nicknames ever, Buchanan-ears, like Buccaneers.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing he does is, at a time when you have know-nothing sentiment is strong, he is going to be seen as the pro-Catholic candidate, and makes clear that he's against the anti-Catholicism of that era. He will barely win Pennsylvania, and the election is fairly close run, especially considering that he's fighting against a new party with John C. Fremont, and you still have the know-nothings around. One of the things that really, of course, hurts him is that him and Stephen Douglas pretty much hate each other. Right? Yeah. I mean, they are truly studying contrast. Now, there are, of course, people who might be contrasting figures who can get along because they have something to bond over. Like, oh, well, I mean, I know this is a comic book, but somebody was joking with somebody. I was like, yeah, you know, of course, Superman and Batman get along. They're both orphans with a strong sense of justice, you know. Well, Douglas and Buchanan have almost nothing in common, but Douglas made his peace with Buchanan in 1856 and helped him get elected.
Mm-hmm.
All right, this is very, very important. So Buchanan going into his presidency, and we'll get into Dred Scott in a second, but I want to make these few other comments about some mistakes that are made. Okay, and then I'll let you guys pick up with Dred Scott because I didn't do as much on Dred Scott. Okay, however, Buchanan's view of himself as president is in many ways peculiar. In a sense, he very much wants to be an active president. His two role models are Jackson and Polk. But he sees himself as the executor of the Constitution and obsessed with the Constitution. You mentioned earlier, Derek, about him having a bunch of law books. Now, you read about most of the presidents of this time, most of them are just reading law books. In fact, it's been said that America was founded by a bunch of legal nerds and run by legal nerds until after the Civil War. One exception to that was Franklin Pierce, the fact that he would read things like Nathaniel Hawthorne and stuff. He was an exception, not the rule. So Buchanan having a bunch of law books, not quite as surprising, although he's very much of that mindset. His cabinet is generally wealthy, Southern, pro-slavery. However, it should be noted that Buchanan made sure that every member of his cabinet was not only not a fire eater, but somebody who had openly denounced fire eaters. That's very important. He wants what he considers Southern Unionists, the most prominent one being Howell Cobb of Georgia. Georgia this time is essentially run by a triumvirate of Robert Toombs, Howell Cobb, Alexander Hamilton Stevens. Stevens and Cobb are Unionists at this time and are very professed in that. So he believes that somebody like Cobb can become the next great leading statesman of the South and hold the place together. Should be noted, Buchanan does not like Jefferson Davis. right?
Hmm.
By the way, they did bring in Cass. Lewis Cass, who at this time he was a kind of old Andrew Jackson holdover. Buchanan and Cass actually didn't really get along much, but it was seen like, hey, let's get one of Andrew Jackson's men in here to show a continuity with the Jackson administration. Cass was made Secretary of State. Secretary of State was usually, of course, the kind of the president's unofficial advisor in many ways. But Buchanan was going to run his own foreign policy, and he pretty much, as he goes on, he increasingly detests Cass.
Hmm.
But one thing is really notable about his cabinet. This is important. There are no Douglas men in the cabinet.
Yeah, four of the future Confederate officers are in his cabinet. He had a huge Southern cabinet.
Yeah, but this is the miscalculation is a misunderstanding of what it means to be a Unionist in the South.
Oh, indeed.
Well, that and
Yeah.
he really didn't make any effort to get along with his VP Breckinridge, who was from the South, and obviously became a Confederate general later. But apparently, he gave Breckinridge such a thorough snub that when Breckinridge showed up to the White House, he could only meet with Buchanan's niece. That was as far as he got.
Huh.
Wow.
Does-
There is. I think there's some evidence they got along better later on. But yes, but once again, in the same case with Breckinridge, Breckinridge actually is in some ways an actual true Unionist. I mean, he joins the Confederate Army because essentially Lincoln's about to arrest him, so he just flees.
So,
The case of
quick
Breckinridge, and
question.
also Breckinridge is an interesting Confederate officer because in the early Civil War, 1861, the Confederates are of course like, we're going to win this, and Breckinridge is like, I don't think so, guys.
So, quick question: Does Buchanan have anyone in his cabinet who's a Northerner he likes? Because I mean, Lewis Cass is a Michiganer. Douglas famously from
Douglas, Illinois. Yeah.
So I'm just thinking.
He doesn't. He doesn't.
Right?
No, he does. No, he does. Jeremiah S. Black.
Were they
In
on decent terms?
Yes. In fact,
You think so?
Yes, I think so.
Okay.
And Black essentially becomes, especially as him and Cobb drift apart, Black becomes his advisor.
Okay.
Yeah.
And where's Black from again?
I'm forgetting off the top of my head, but he's not a Southerner. I'm going to pull up the cabinet here real quick just so I got it handy.
I was just curious about that.
Yeah.
Well, Black is from Pennsylvania.
Well,
Okay, that makes sense.
that makes sense.
Yeah. He also has.
Douglas one-
he was on the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. I mean, I was going to say like he looks like the picture of if you go in some really old law firm, they have their founders on the wall. I mean, his picture would fit in perfectly.
Oh, there was also Isaac. The Secretary of the Navy is Isaac Townsend, and they got along fairly well. And Townsend, he's from Connecticut. In fact, Townsend's going to be the only member of this cabinet that is going to have a decent reputation when he leaves, historically. But I'll get into him. I'll mention him more minor. I'll mention stuff about him a little later. I think the Douglas one is very, very important here. This sort of reminds me of George W. Bush when he became president in 2001. There's a contrast between him and Ronald Reagan. Reagan's administration was very, very good at making sure that every faction of the Republican Party had prominent posts, right? George W. Bush did not do that. A lot of factions of the Republican Party felt snubbed by Bush, in particular, and that's why his administration had that heavy neoconservative flavor, because that group really was in the driver's seat. So there's an example of that. Another one would be James Garfield. I mean, James Garfield essentially has to beg Grant and Roscoe Conkling to support him in 1880. I mean, not publicly beg, but privately, right? Mm-hmm. And he rewards them with very few posts. And and then one of the orbiters, of course, I mean, not that he was a major figure or anything, was of course Charles Guiteau, who's an angry office seeker, so Buchanan is a Southern heavy cabinet, but every Southerner is somebody who is a Southern Unionist, which it's worth explaining what that means. So in the South, of course, you do have diehard Unionists. All right. Then you have people who are definitely Unionists, are against secession, but they will end up fighting in the Civil War because, hey, your neighbor's doing it. There's a lot of
Right.
pressure on you. Yeah. For instance, I found out that Shelby Foote's great-grandfather was a Confederate officer who resigned about a year into the war. And in his letter talking about pardon, he said, "I never backed the Confederacy. I did it out of local pressure. So you don't look like a traitor or a coward," which is no minor thing. I mean, there was a guy in New Orleans I read about who got lynched in the streets because he was pro-union. So there's that. Then you have what you would call the conditional unionist, and a lot that's who these men are. A lot of them are conditional unionists because they still believe that secession is legal. And then, of course, you've got the fire eaters, and the fire eaters are going to conceive this brilliant idea that if you can just get one southern state to secede, the rest will follow, and you can drag the conditional unionists along, which is successful. That's why I think Yancey of Alabama is one of the 5 or 10 most important men of this period.
Sure.
Yeah, definitely. Because he conceives of that strategy, he executes it, he pulls it off.
I want to talk dig in a little bit about this, because we've gone over, Sean, you've sort of provided a good detailed sort of look at Buchanan's biographical life. And I think a larger understanding of the sort of milieu of politics in the 1850s is going to be sort of helpful before we sort of jump into like Dred Scott, right?
Right. We'll get to know like just how bad the situation has gotten.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, because we talk about like pro-slavery unionists, and I guess kind of my critique even of that language is that like everyone who's pro-slavery is a unionist at the time. There are very few fire eaters, because what's the reason to secede in 1856?
Because the Constitution protects slavery.
Yeah.
So yeah, like Cobb. How Cobb? He's a slave owner. What does he own? Like 100 slaves? Cobb?
Major slave owner.
Yeah, he's a huge slave owner in Georgia. So yeah, there's no reason to, and that's an excellent point. Yeah, there's no reason to succeed at this very moment because their institution is protected, right? So things are comfortable until it's not, right?
Yeah.
Well, I want to understand the nature of fire eaters as well. Okay. There are a number of prominent Southern politicians who are fire eaters. Jefferson Davis was at one time a fire eater. Okay.
Sure.
And some of his ardor for that is tempers down when he's in the Pierce administration.
Right, because he doesn't want to really succeed at first. Later on, he thinks that being the senator from Mississippi he doesn't want to. He does not want to succeed from the Union when he's appointed. Mm-hmm. So his opinion could have changed by clearly 1860.
Yeah, and I will also say that the other thing to understand about the other thing to understand about the makeup of the fire eaters. Fire eaters are very popular on a more local level because your average fire eater is young.
Right.
So you read about Confederate officers in the Civil War. The older ones were the kind of guys who are like, "You sure you want to do this?" The younger officers, a lot of times, are running to the boggeries, writing about it, and be like, "Oh, this guy's really into secession." And by the way, the other hotbed of secession is Florida.
Sure.
Oh my.
In fact, in some ways, I'd say Florida is more fire eater than South Carolina. It's just such an inconsequential state compared to the rest.
I mean, it's less established. I mean, in some ways, that actually makes a lot of sense. And it's, in terms of public opinion on this idea of secession and on this idea of who controls the federal government, the sort of timeline that I understand, the timeline that I sort of think fairly accurately describes this, is you have growing anti-slavery sentiment in the North. Anti-slavery, not abolition, right? Anti-slavery sentiment. And there's sort of a period of what I would call radicalization. I don't necessarily mean radicalization as in like, anti-slavery sentiment is bad, but more that people come around to that understanding. And it's this sort of period of around like 1853, 1854 or where it gets seeded. And it gets seeded from Uncle Tom's Cabin being published. And not only just being published and people reading it, but then people making plays out of it. People making like rudimentary like moving pictures out of it. And they will actually literally like move like stage sets across the stage and kind of run a play behind it effectively. And these things are being shown in small northern towns all over the place. They're basically like carnivals that go going from town to town to town to town. And then as that's happening, you are having huge uproars due to the Fugitive Slave Act. And
yes, because that brings
federal marshals. Yeah, and federal marshals.
Franklin Pierce really screwed up with that one when he sent that marshal into Boston.
So
that's one of Franklin Pierce. That's a big mistake.
So let me tell about that really quick, because I want to kind of give the landscape of political opinion in the North and then contrast it with political opinion in the South, right? And so those federal marshals are effectively sent up into northern cities to hunt down people who have effectively escaped slavery, throw them in prison, and then send them back down south, right? And there's this sort of very unique sort of period where you have public opinion in the North changing due to this. Because it's one thing for a lot of like racist white Northerners just to be like, who the hell cares what happens in Mississippi? I don't give a damn, right? But like, when suddenly it's your neighbor being taken away and it's someone you know and someone you like, right? Like, that becomes a profound attack on Northern liberty, and attack actually on Northern states' rights. And I think that's something that's not understood often, is that like, in some ways, the anti-slavery movement is actually a states' rights movement. A federal...
I say that all the time, Michael.
That all the time. Oh, that's awesome.
I do. So no, I say that all the time. I say the southern states do not own the term states' rights, like it's often used to defend slavery. But no, I say that all the time in my classes, that the North feels that their states' rights are being a trend upon, because you spoke about Franklin Pierce, but you're speaking about, that's Anthony Burns, who was dragged out of Boston, and as a result, Massachusetts, that's their states' rights not to have slavery in their state. So being that the Fugitive Slave Act deputizes random citizens to, the federal marshals, they go into Boston, they take Anthony Burns out of Boston. That is a violation of states' rights. You mentioned Uncle Tom's Cabin. That's Margaret Garner. That book is written about a real person, a woman. Her name is Margaret Garner. And that's another states' rights issue. She's running across the Ohio River from Kentucky to a free state of Ohio. She's fleeing the federal marshals behind her. And again, the northern states' rights are infringed upon because she has to be returned due to this Fugitive Slave Act.
Yeah. No, that's great. I really, the more that sort of message I feel like can get into like classrooms, the better. Like, honestly, because it's this whole like Southern states' rights thing. I don't know. It's just sort of taken over the discourse on this period. It drives me nuts because it's states' rights being violated effectively.
That comes out of the Dunning School. That's the lost cause narrative. That's the lost cause narrative.
Yeah. And I wanted to just mention briefly about sort of Anthony Burns. It's not a small amount of people sort of being mad about this. Like 50,000 people come out on the streets of Boston to jeer the Marines who are effectively bringing Anthony Burns back into slavery, being marched through the streets of Boston to the port to where he's going to be sent down back to Norfolk, Virginia. So it's a big deal. So anyway, the reason why I wanted to mention that sort of northern public opinion, because I don't think that southern public opinion on slavery it gets super radicalized until a little bit later, right? Until like 1858, especially 1859 with John Brown. That's when I feel like the secessionist movement really starts to like kick in, right?
And Bleeding Kansas, you know.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah,
and also but that one's going on, of course, at the same time. Yes, and I do want to note that before we get into that one, that Buchanan's belief was that the slavery issue would destroy the Union. He'd been talking about that since like 1820s, right?
Thomas Jefferson.
Oh yeah, but what I mean is that it wasn't a passing thing. He dreads this. He believes it is the North that is doing the agitation. They have the ones who have become radicalized, and so to head them off, for lack of a better way to put it, James Buchanan is going to coddle the Southern Unionists. His grave miscalculation with them is not understanding that those Unionists were conditional Unionists, and like you said, the condition is slavery is not threatened, so we're fine with the Union as it is. You know, this is going to be his miscalculation.
Well, also another miscalculation that he makes is that he thinks that because of the Dred Scott decision, that everybody will just calm down about slavery and say, well, I guess it's the law of the land. That settles that.
Because that's projection. That's such projection with him, too. Because remember, he's this legalist obsessed with the Constitution. So Buchanan's the kind of guy where if he read a law that said that, he'd be like, okay, well, it's the law.
Yeah.
Whatever the law said. You know, this guy should be like a judge in the Judge Dredd universe, you know?
No, I mean, he would be a perfect imperial functionary in the Star Wars universe.
God, you're right. Yeah. So he's now not legalist. So he's projecting the way that he would approach it to all these other people.
I mean, so I was just going to mention, he seems profoundly disconnected with Northern public opinion at this time. Like, the fact that he's thinking that white Northerners are the ones being radicalized over this issue, right? Like, does he understand the difference between anti-slavery and abolitionist sentiment? Like, and I don't think necessarily. And
I don't think he cares.
Yeah, he might not, right?
Because, I mean, at this time, think three-fifths compromise, Southern states have the power. Who would you much rather align with? People who have, well, it sounds like now, the people who have the power or the people who are just trying to gain power. Right now, he feels like he's going to align with the Southern states, in their perspective.
Yes. And also,
and he's not even thinking about wage labor, right? Like it's not even, like you mentioned, Michael. Right, like you mentioned, you have abolition, then you have anti-slavery, right? You have people who just want jobs. They can care less about where black people land, where freedmen land, where slaves land. Enslaved where they land. They are looking for wage labor and ways where they can be employed, because slavery puts everyone out of business, right? So they're looking for that as well, and I think that's kind of where Lincoln's able to tap into those people.
Right. Yeah.
There's also one other political dimension going on here. Now, him and Pierce weren't friends, they weren't enemies, they were fairly neutral to each other. The way Pierce operated in 1852 is that the Democratic Party had been swept into power, and I believe that Pierce saw, man, we're going to make this we're going to make the Democratic Party nigh unstoppable. And then, of course, Northern Democrats start getting slaughtered over Kansas, Nebraska, right? So they're getting massacred, and that's another thing too, is that he doesn't understand Northern opinion, because remember, a lot of his friends are Southerners. At the same time, because of the Pierce administration, the Democratic Party is now more reliant on the South than it was before, because of Pierce's political failure. So he is now also, I believe, remember, he is a narrow partisan, so he's going to be even doubly pro-Southern, because he sees as this way for the political party to survive at the same time. So the pressure's on him for this. He's got personal pressures, and personal pressures and political ones. So anyway, what do we do next then?
Well,
what do you guys think?
I would like to talk about sort of his ideas of what a president is and their powers relative to Congress, and then maybe after that look at what he thought his presidency would be, what he envisioned, because obviously that is not going to happen.
Oh yeah, I would like to say one quick thing though before, because this will be going to lead into that. I pulled up the thing for his inauguration, which actually it was actually a good inauguration, nice party and everything, right? And then there was the Russian minister was at the grand ball for the inauguration, and he essentially was talking to people and going like saying the equivalent of, "Don't you get the feeling we are dancing on a volcano?"
Wow.
Proceed, sir.
So, when it came to his idea about the presidency, having worked in a lot of administrations in one capacity or another since Jackson, he basically had come to the conclusion that every president should be a lawyer, and that the worst thing possible is a general for president because they just won't respect the process. So I guess it's a good thing he didn't live through the Gilded Age, because otherwise he would have been deeply depressed the whole time.
Wow.
He also thought that the only two people who were generals who made good presidents were Washington and Jackson. He also said that under no circumstances could Congress ever hold a hearing about a president. So if he believed in checks and balances, that was one he wanted to get rid of. He also thought that he could ask for preemptive authorization for anything he wanted to do in foreign policy. So basically, he wanted the War Powers Acts as they exist now. So Bush era and beyond level war powers are what Buchanan really wanted. So in some ways, he was ahead of his time, and not in a good way, though. Because normally when we say somebody's ahead of their time, we mean it positively. In this case, he was ahead of his time, not necessarily in a good way.
So I actually found something on this in an article about Buchanan and secession, and I kind of just wanted to read this because I found it very interesting. It's on this exact question, if you guys don't mind.
Sure.
It says, considering what was obviously a significant threat to the Union, Buchanan had developed some interrogatories for his cabinet officer Black to answer. All 5 dealt with the relationship between the state and federal government in the looming crisis, and the power of the executive in relation to the legislative branch of the national government. The last 2 of Buchanan's questions to Black was crucial. What are the legal means at my disposal for executing those laws of the United States which are usually administered through the courts and their officers? Can a military force be used for any purpose, whatever, under the Militia Acts of 1795 and 1807, within the limits of a state where there are no judges, marshals, or other civil officers? And it says Black's answers were tautological and unhelpful, but they did not foreclose legal actions by the president. For example, the Attorney General advised that the Militia Act of 1807 authorized the use of military force in cases where it is lawful. The chief executive must make the judgment as to its legality. So it seems like he was very much obsessing over this exact question.
Yes, I guess
in his presidency.
The executive power theory, or I know there's a current sort of legalistic explanation of what this is that has a lot of supporters. But anyway, he's basically way ahead of his time on all of those issues. In terms of just pure executive privilege and full control over foreign policy in one person's hands.
Oh, yeah. And it's something, and before we get into what you wanted to do, Derek, about what he expects of his presidency, he really does want an active foreign policy. I mean, he's going to send a military force to Paraguay.
Yeah.
He is bellicose with the British over a dispute in Puget Sound. Remember, he's probably thinking to himself, "Man, I still want the rest of Oregon." Oh, yeah. This leads to the Pig War, where George Pickett, who Confederate general, will tell the British officer, "We'll make a Bunker Hill out of this." And the British officer said, "You lost that battle, right?"
Yeah.
And diplomacy, anti-British, try to take Cuba, and if you can't take more of Mexico, maybe you should just make Mexico a protectorate. And that's the one thing that Buchanan will do is, for all these reasons, the United States Navy will be expanded by him.
And he tries to buy Alaska at this time, by the way, too.
Oh, I didn't even know that one. Oh,
yeah. The original negotiations for the Alaska Purchase happened during Buchanan's presidency. It's eventually put off until after the Civil War due to internal stuff.
I didn't know that. That's interesting. I guess that means that when Seward picks up that negotiation, that the Russians had already been thinking about their price for a long time. That's interesting.
Oh yeah, they wanted to sell ever since the Crimean War. Because
they're
they
afraid,
knew
they're
they
afraid the
couldn't
British will
control
hold
it.
it.
Exactly.
They're afraid
Yeah.
the British will grab it. And of course, that's going to be once again, that Anglophobia. The selling point, one of the selling points for Alaska is, well, we friend the British from getting it.
No, that's right.
Yeah.
Anyway, just wanted to jump in. Go ahead.
No problem, man. All right. Go ahead, Derek.
So, in terms of what he wanted to do as president, he believed once again that Dred Scott would settle the slavery issue and he could just do pure foreign policy for 4 years. So he thought he was going to have the full support of the nation to go manifest destiny on steroids. The Mexican War was a warm-up for what he wanted to do. And he also thought that one way he would kill the anti-slavery movement was to keep anyone who has abolitionist sentiments out of the patronage network. So that was one criteria he had, was that you cannot get a job in the government through the patronage system if you are in any way anti-slavery. So his idea was, okay, that slavery will kind of die out on its own eventually, or at least in those northern climates it won't really take hold, so it's not really an issue. People are just being hyperbolic. So once they figure out that it's the law of the land, we're going to be all cool. What I want to do is conquer, let's see, where all did he want to conquer? Because I got a list here. So Cuba, obviously, we already talked about that with the Austin memo. That was only a couple years earlier.
Mexico.
Pretty much Mexico. He also wanted to handle all this personally. Like we talked about Lewis Cass already being 75 and just being there for the sake of appearance, but in reality, Buchanan worked behind his back all the time. He also micromanaged in general because of those long meetings, so he knew every detail of every office. But mostly he was looking to do grand conquest. He was not really interested in domestic policy. So in that way, he's a lot like George H.W. Bush, except he wanted to annex more or less almost all of North America, or at least a whole hell of a lot of it.
There's yes, and we were going to mention Alaska. He's kind of thinking about going to war with Britain over Oregon. There's some debate on that one, but again too. But was it I'll read this one from the National Intelligencer. Had something to say about this. They've said that they're looking at all these things. He says they said we must retrench the extravagant list of magnificent schemes which has the sanction of the executive. The great Napoleon himself, with all the resources of an empire at his sole command, never ventured the simultaneous accomplishment of so many daring projects: the acquisition of Cuba, the construction of the Pacific Railroad, a Mexican protectorate, international preponderance in Central America in spite of all the powers of Europe, the submission of distant South American states, the enlargement of the Navy, a largely increased standing army. What government on earth could possibly meet all the exigencies of such a flood of innovations?
The one of James Buchanan.
Yes, this man is, this is one of the, I guess I say the best kept secret about Buchanan is just how aggressive he is in these regards. So once he sees himself as a foreign policy president who will settle this legally, because once again he's projecting what he would do on other people. But that is something about that too, though. Think about this, and I'm thinking even more about George W. Bush. Even Buchanan's own cabinet starts getting annoyed about this kind of stuff. Like, Jeremiah Black said of him, he is a stubborn old gentleman, very fond of having his own way. And I don't know what his way is. Testament to Buchanan not always being the best interpersonal communication. Secretary of War Floyd, often on the short list for worst secretaries of war ever. Also on the short list of one of the worst Confederate generals ever. A real accomplished fellow. Also on the short list of one of the worst governors of Virginia. You get the drift here. Floyd said, Mr. Buchanan was different from General Jackson. General Jackson could be coaxed from his purpose, but Mr. B could never be coaxed nor driven.
Yeah, he's also, I guess, he tends to be very autocratic in his leadership style. He also apparently has zero tolerance for dissent, where he effectively thinks you're an idiot or a radical if you disagree with him on anything.
Oh yes, that is a fact. Every Republican who he disagreed with, he completely called them an extremist. He called him a black Republican. You guys know how that was used back in the day.
Yep.
So
Everyone said like Ayn Rand was like that, where she was like, obviously logically, Rachmaninoff is the greatest composer of all time. I mean, objectively, right? And I'm like, I'm like, look, I get it. You're both like fled the Russian Revolution, right? That's where it comes from.
I like Rachmaninoff.
So no, Buchanan. If you disagree with him, then yes, then there's like, how could you possibly come to this conclusion?
You'll get kicked out of the program.
You all, and of course, one of the most infamous things about the Dred Scott decision is that he pressured Roger Taney into making it more expansive.
Oh, yes.
Now, I mean, Roger Taney himself was essentially an Andrew Jackson stooge. Because, if Andrew Jackson had told Roger Taney to cut his own head off, he would have done it.
Puppet.
Yeah. So, well, Taney is a Democratic partisan, so he follows his orders and gives a even more expansive judgment than he was even prepared to do because of Buchanan's pressure. Because, as we're saying, Buchanan thinks we'll just have the court say this, and then we're done. Slam, bam, thank you, ma'am. We can move on now, right? That's what they're thinking. You guys have any comments on Dred Scott? I didn't do as much.
Yeah. Let's actually talk about Dred Scott a bit. So
then I have a lot more stuff on Lecompton. So you guys hit up Dred Scott. I'm gonna get some water, okay?
Yeah. Right. Monica, do you want to jump in on Dred Scott or?
Sure, we both can, Mike.
Yeah, go for it.
No, I mean, go for it. Dred Scott. Yeah, Dred and Harriet Scott. We can't leave her out.
Right. Yeah, no. You feel free to start.
Sure. I don't mind. So Dred Scott was an enslaved man, right, in Missouri, St. Louis. Have you guys seen that statue, by the way? It's kind of downtown by the riverfront. They have a statue there of Dred and Harriet. Yeah, it's beautiful.
Oh, that's awesome. Huh.
Yeah. Well, you're actually not too terribly far from it.
Yeah.
Not too terribly, but anyway, so yeah, he is taken to several territories. Okay, and because of being taken into territories and free states, Dred Scott petitioned for his freedom. Which is very common. Freedom suits, what they were called, where several enslaved people sued for their freedom. Roger B. Taney, who was the Supreme Court justice at the time, ruled in that case. Do you want to fill in on any of this, Michael?
Sure. So I'll just say it's a small thing. Yeah, so Scott actually lived at Fort Snelling up around modern day Minneapolis. I believe. Yeah, I was taken there. Sorry, I believe his enslaver was like a doctor for a military doctor. I think.
And he was a traveling military doctor who took him from Missouri to Minnesota to that territory.
And I think it's worth to mention as well. Most of Minnesota territory at this time is Dakota territory, and there will eventually be a war between the Dakota and the United States during the Civil War. So Fort Snelling is like the main American fort there. That is sort of on, in this case, sort of northern expansion, but sort of western expansion here. And so, anyway, I always find the sort of interlinking between Native American history and the history of slavery to be very interesting. And this is sort of one of those cases.
It is. And, Roger B. Taney clearly ruled that, those aggressive terms, as I quote, no black man has the rights that a white man is bound to respect, is the ruling of that, and ruled that his state determined his position, right? So being that he was enslaved in Missouri and then taken to these free territories, later states, didn't make a difference. What else? Dred Scott, it ruled that black people aren't citizens of the United States anyway, so the fact that he tried to sue was irrelevant. Clearly, black Americans don't become citizens until after the Civil War. That's the 14th Amendment.
Yeah.
So yes, this Dred Scott decision pretty much put the United States in a little bit of uproar because they feel like if Dred Scott can be taken into all these free territories and free states, then slavery is essentially everywhere, right? So if an
Yeah.
enslaved person can be taken from Alabama, Mississippi, in this case Missouri, and taken to other places, then what's the point of having free states and non-free states? And that goes back to the prior conversation where we were saying that northern states were their states' rights were being infringed upon, right? Because if Dred Scott could be taken from Missouri up to, over to Illinois, then slavery's in Illinois. So it very the line in the sand. For most historians, they believe it's this Dred Scott decision that pretty much put people in positions to where they're ready to take a stand against the institution of slavery.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to add as well, it's the decision itself is so incredibly illogical. It makes zero sense because if Dred Scott doesn't have standing to sue in court, that should be the end of it, right? Like Tawny, by even going to say that to basically legalize slavery in northern territories is massively overreaching, because he can't first say that Dred Scott has the right to sue and then rule effectively on that suit. The like very obvious sort of answer to this case, even if you even support slavery at this point, the very obvious answer to this case is just dismiss the lawsuit. Say Dred Scott doesn't have standing to sue, we're done. And not even say anything about whether slavery is allowed in northern territories. Therefore, by sort of de facto, slavery would continue to be banned by the Missouri Compromise in these northern territories. So this is legally, not only just like morally a very radical decision, it's legally an incredibly radical decision at the time.
Absolutely. The Dred Scott decision, and clearly, him and Harriet, they eventually gained their freedom.
Yeah.
But it's jarring because of the position of the Supreme Court. Roger B. Taney taking that position at that time, pretty much, like I said, it put the United States in a position to where people feel like they don't have a choice. They have to accept slavery. We mentioned Anthony Burns and Margaret Garner earlier. And then in addition, you have slave rebellions, right? They're happening consecutively quite often. We didn't even talk about like Nat Turner or Vesey or anything like that. But all of these things are occurring, intertwined simultaneously. It's putting the United States at a fever pitch. And in my opinion, I don't think there's, like, once the Dred Scott decision happens, and then of course you have the caning of Sumter, I don't think there's any going back as far as whether or not this nation's going to last with slavery. I think it's pretty much going to implode.
Yeah, I agree.
That Dred Scott decision, it affected everyone. Because people are, I think it was more jarring than the Fugitive Slave Act. And that's an opinion, because the Fugitive Slave Act was just ridiculous. But the Dred Scott decision was not only the Supreme Court ruling that, he's merchandise, essentially, but they're ruling that enslaved people can be taken anywhere and they're still enslaved, because Dred Scott's argument was he was taken to other places, right, that were free and or territories, because slavery was protected, number one, by the federal Constitution, but it was also protected by the state Constitution. And Dred Scott's position was these territories, Minnesota, Dakotas, like, they don't even have a state constitution yet. So his position was, how am I enslaved? That's his position, right? Because it's not legal in this place yet. But anyway, like I said, Taney ruled that his state determine his servitude position, and thus that was Missouri being a slave state since 1820.
Yeah, and I wanted to emphasize here, Dred Scott lived at Fort Snelling. In Illinois, wasn't it like for years? Like, this is not a minor freaking visit. This is like,
right,
clearly permanent residence.
right.
And the other sort of interesting thing I read on this, so I read an article about it by Paul Finkelman, and he basically makes the argument, sort of Buchanan's role in this, interestingly enough, was a sense that sort of a very legalistic argument Buchanan makes, basically saying that the Supreme Court should just decide this issue. Who cares? And and Finkelman kind of makes the point actually by arguing he shouldn't intervene. He is in fact intervening because every single president says the legislature should decide this, not the Supreme Court. By Buchanan basically just, throwing up his hands, he's in fact putting his thumb on the scale here. And he's saying, well, the Supreme Court will figure it out. Legislature doesn't need to do anything about it. There's almost this weird sort of, it's interesting because we started this discussion saying Buchanan was always concerned about unity and about the country breaking apart over slavery. But yet when it comes to the actual nitty-gritty work of ensuring that the country doesn't break apart over slavery, he doesn't seem interested in it. He seems incredibly naive again and again and again.
Yeah, and I've said that several. Yeah. Two things. Jackson and Buchanan. Johnson and Jackson too, but more so Johnson and Buchanan are some of the presidents who I feel like either they were not equipped or just plain not equipped. And I know I'm aware of the legal background of these gentlemen, but that doesn't say much. There's a lot of broke attorneys in the world. So that doesn't really say a lot. That just doesn't mean much to me. So like winning and losing is the game in law. And these guys would have lost a lot of cases and would have been some very unemployed attorneys. And I'm going to tell you, like, I really think that Buchanan felt that South had the power, which they did, like I mentioned.
Yeah.
And if anything was to happen, the Southern states will be fine. Because they're thinking, okay, they have, of course, agriculture, but they're trading that agriculture not only to the Union states, the northern states, but more so to England. So I think they had an exit strategy. It wasn't thought out very well, but I think the brain power that they thought they had some type of exit strategy. And I don't feel like Buchanan thought that he needed to cater to the Union, to the northern states. I don't necessarily think he felt he had to. I think he felt that whichever way the southern states wanted to go, he was willing to do that. And that's pretty much, the way it went. I just don't feel like look at his cabinet. He had a couple Northerners in there, but I just don't feel like he was in the position to where he felt that he needed to give the northern states any attention. You don't have any power is what he's thinking. I don't have to cater to you.
Right.
And that's pretty much, in my opinion, what I felt like, reading on Buchanan, reading about the presidents prior to him, and of course, the dismantling of the Union upon Lincoln's election. I guess they call that Monday morning quarterbacking, but you see so many places where things could have been cut off at the knees, right? Where you're like, if this would have happened, this wouldn't have happened. All these chain reactions just happened simultaneously over and over. Him being the president, having executive authority, I think if he would have stepped in Dred Scott, things could have been better. Kansas could have been better. Several things, without a doubt.
Yeah.
He will make a few concessions to the North, but they tend to be more minor. He's got his personal proclivities, and his party is tied to the South at this point. But that being said, As far as him being
And they bullied him. They bullied him, Sean.
There's going to be a. I'm gonna get to that eventually. There's gonna be a big knife in his back from Al Cobb.
Yeah, right? Like Alexander Stevens. Right? Alexander Stevens says, if Kansas is not a slave state, Buchanan should be killed. Like
I know. No. There's gonna be a kidnapping plot by one of these guys. I'm gonna. They talk real okay?
Like they bullied. That said a lot about what they thought of him. Like they bullied him. They talked real crazy to his face. Like
that's wild.
Yeah.
Oh, it's gonna. The other thing, one of the things that hurts him too, by the way. Remember we mentioned his friend King from before.
Oh yes.
And one of my King was not a conditional unionist. King was a hardcore unionist, and from what I've read, his death was a major blow to the leadership of the more strongly Union Southerners. To be fair, King was a much older man by that time too. But he briefly served as Pierce's vice president. I gave his dead like a month in. The other thing too though is God, what was I going to say though? Sorry. No, he's one thing. Oh, yeah, that's right. You were mentioning about being an attorney. Buchanan was a very good lawyer, and actually, that was one thing. In fact, one of the feelings I got is that he probably should have went into law instead of politics. In fact, fun fact: you know who also told him he should have went into law and not politics? His father.
Huh?
Yeah, his
father early on was like, "Be a lawyer, don't be a politician."
Mm-hmm.
That's
so a lot of the books talked about how he was a good capitalist.
Oh yeah, no, he's good. He's good at making money. Yeah, which I think would just briefly do Panic of 1857.
Yes, that was what I was.
Sure.
And the Meadows Massacre in Utah. Remember the Meadows Massacre?
Oh yeah, we're going to that. Oh, yeah, we could. You wouldn't do because Lecompton's so complicated. Do you want to do Panic of 1857 and then Utah War?
Yeah.
Good thing. So Panic of 1857. This was caused by speculation craze. Now, of all the panics of the 1800s, this is the one that is probably the least discussed. But Buchanan's reaction to it was essentially to do nothing.
Sounds about right.
Well, apparently that's the Jacksonian Democrat response. So he was just going with the orthodoxy that had been established.
He's going with the orthodoxy. Yeah.
And just as quick, Dan, I was going to say just as quick background to the listeners. The reason why it's called a panic and not a recession or a depression is because it's a literal panic as normal Americans run to their banks to try to get the money out before the bank collapses, or you get nothing.
And this one's very important politically. All right, because I've always been like, I've always wondered, like, how does the Panic of 1857 affect the Civil War? I've heard people say that it really didn't, but no, I would say that it does because it does. Because Buchanan does nothing, right? And you had mentioned earlier, Monica, about manufacturing. That's what's hit. The North is hit hard with the Panic of 1857. The South barely is. So there's two effects. In the North, you have a bunch of people have their difficulties and problems, and part of the Republican Party's platform is, what is that? Like free soil, free labor, free men.
Yeah, wage labor.
They're making the case of Buchanan should have done something about this, and this orthodoxy needs to go. So a lot of your factory workers are now going to start going Republican.
And
at the same time,
also,
okay.
No, you're good, Sean. But I was going to say also that Panic of 1857, it really bows to the idea of the Southern theorists at this time, Fitzhugh and Hammond, who are saying wage labor is unstable, slavery is much more a benefit to the nation. You see what happens. In fact, white people are made slaves with this. You see, it can collapse and you can lose all your money. So it actually bows toward their argument when this occurred.
Yes, and the other argument too is that they were relatively unaffected. So they said, you see, staple agricultural crops are more reliable than these newfangled factories and your grand investment banks. And it actually makes the South more confident, and this is really when your idea of King Cotton is becomes truly king. So it leads to an increase in the South's, for lack of a better word, arrogance over the economy. They believe that they got the better of it, and it proves just how inferior the North is. And yes, exactly, the Mudsill thing, or what George Fitzhugh wrote that book, Cannibals, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
so
James
that's
Henry
pretty much what the Pan
Hammond.
1887 does. It just hurts Buchanan more, and is causing them further sectional drift. You want to go into the Utah War? I didn't do that one too much.
Sure. Just one final note on the panic. So Buchanan, when he came into office, of course, just like pretty much every president up until FDR, promised fiscal restraint. Actually, I guess FDR promised it too, but don't worry about it. Anyway, promised fiscal restraint, balanced budget, but because of the panic screwing up the revenue, he ended up increasing the federal budget, increasing the debt and deficit, and so when he left office, the deficit was up to a record $17 million. And a lot of that is because of the panic.
Oh, yeah. And also, a lot of the ways that the government was getting money was through land sales. And, with all this controversy over what the hell's going to happen in the West, land sales declined. Yeah. So, Utah War, everybody?
Mountain Meadow?
Go right ahead.
Yeah.
All right. I got the
Mormons.
So who has Utah War? I didn't really have too much on it.
I have a little bit on it.
Well, the Mormons have been persecuted. You know that. They have been persecuted since New York, Joseph Smith, he finds tablets. And they migrate to Illinois. They run out of Illinois. They go to Missouri. They run out of Missouri for their practices. And they're kind of wandering a little bit, and they're trekking across the frontier, kind of like most people at this time. And they, by this time, Brigham Young is their leader. And, let's see. They assumed that some people who were behind them were Americans trying to kill them because they Americans were, let's just say, I'm trying to use nice words here. They were run out of all those other states that I mentioned. So let's just say the Mormons were on edge, if I may, right? They assumed that Americans were on their way to Utah to harm them. But they weren't. They were actually people on the Oregon Trail, I believe. But by then, Brigham Young and everyone had settled in Utah. They were all set up. And the people coming across the West were just settlers looking to try to seek a better life. And, the Mormons dressed up like Native Americans and massacred them. I think it was like 127 pioneers, women and children. Covered up for quite a long time.
And Brigham Young tried to frame
it.
They
built a monument there, and then the monument got like disassembled by the Mormons.
Yeah, I said, I don't want to be offensive to people who practice the Church of Latter-day Saints, but I mean it happened. So I mean, like I said, I'm watching my words, but they tried to frame local natives for that. And from the reports that I read, like, people were well aware that they were pioneers. Oh,
yeah.
It wasn't any mistaken that those were like Americans trying to harm them.
Yeah, and pretty much this crisis would be handled by one of Buchanan's Pennsylvania buddies who was sympathetic to the Mormons, Thomas Kane. So he'd go out. He negotiated a peaceful end, and I imagine he learned the truth but kept it under wraps just to maintain peace. And of course, the federal army was also deployed, but they couldn't enter Utah because they deployed late, and then winter fell, and they didn't want to get stuck in a mountain pass. So Kane was able to go and negotiate an end. And effectively, the only punishment is that Brigham Young more or less just stepped down as governor and only was the head of the church. But because that whole colony was all Mormon, effectively he still was in control. So really he did not pay any meaningful penalty for the massacre.
Zero. Right. Zero. Not
And,
at all.
and apparently Buchanan was also horrified to learn about polygamy. So that was one of the very few times where he found something morally repugnant.
Oh.
So for whatever reason, like, most other things didn't bother him morally because he's a super legalist, but he would rant and rave about how messed up polygamy was.
Yeah.
So I guess everybody
Yeah, I'm
has.
sorry. I was laughing. I
have so much.
I was thinking of Nixon. I was thinking of laughing because I was thinking of Nixon in his rants.
Oh.
Yeah, and for Buchanan, because this was resolved successfully, he thought that this was a great victory that would then propel him into his other goals. So the next year, 1858, he bragged all the time about how well he did handling the Mormon crisis.
I'm going to segue into Lecompton. Then talking about the Union thing, his 1856 election, the election motto is "Save the Union." That's a big part of his speech. And then we're talking about I do believe he takes the thing seriously. He just makes his grave miscalculation, partially because of Southern sympathies and legalistic mind. And like we said, he thought he could just handle Dred Scott and move on. Right? Things up is what Mark Summers used to tell us was when he thought the Civil War became inevitable. The Lecompton Constitution.
Yep.
100%.
Yeah.
Which Buchanan favored.
Did I conk out?
No, you're fine.
Oh, what?
You didn't go out. You're fine.
Yeah. No. I mean,
you're here. Wait, did Monica go out?
No, I'm here.
Okay,
we're all... got you. Okay. All right. Yeah, we're all here now. How are you? Well, we're sending a squad in. That's probably Star Wars fans. So, the Lecompton Constitution is, let me see when this one. Before I hand this off to Michael, because I believe Michael knows quite a bit about this, and also one thing to note about it is one way that this is another Buchanan error is that he's thinking, if I just get this Constitution through fast as I can, it'll mollify it'll mollify the Southerners, and he believes he has enough votes in Congress to pull it off anyway. But also, he once again thinks Buchanan believed at Bleeding Kansas, with everybody in there, that the fighting that was going on there would be the actual flashpoint where a civil war would start. If you had told Buchanan the Civil War was going to start in Charleston Harbor, he'd been like, no, it's going to start in Kansas. Mm-hmm. And so he, in his legalistic, narrow party focus, thinks that if he just gets this Constitution through, that he can head off the entire Civil War. So go ahead, Michael. What's the details in Lecompton? Why is this Constitution so messed up?
Sure, yeah, and you probably know more about it than I do, but I'll just sort of I'll set the stage here. I mean,
gotcha.
So like before we get directly to the Lecompton Constitution, it's worth to note kind of what's happening in Kansas at the time. So Kansas is one of the territories under the Kansas-Nebraska Act, right? Which legally is now under popular sovereignty because of Stephen Douglas's Kansas-Nebraska Act passed, I believe, in 1854. And so the response of Northerners and Southerners is to rush into Kansas, try to set up communities, because popular sovereignty basically means, slavery is voted on by the inhabitants of the territory. And so you need some sort of political organization to have a vote on a proposed territorial constitution and then state constitution. And there has to be some rules to decide who gets to vote, where is the Constitution held, all of that. And so what you really start to see is actually anti-slavery societies funding white Northerners to go and settle in Kansas. And they do so fairly successfully. And it becomes pretty clear that anti-slavery forces are going to have the majority in Kansas. So how do the pro-slavery forces respond? Well, you send over people from Missouri, a slave state, to go vote in these elections. Now, you don't know which election is going to be the sort of crucial election that's going to actually end up writing the actual state constitution, right? Because you're having different towns like write constitutional documents all the time, effectively, and try to claim they are sort of the sort of true progenitors of public opinion. And so there are times where you have anti-slavery towns hold sort of referendums, write a constitution and those constitutions just aren't accepted from the federal government because the federal government knows this is a freaking landmine and no one should touch it. This very arrogant guy who thinks he's just gonna solve the darn issue, right? And so that's where Lecompton comes in, because Lecompton is a group of pro-slavery people who write this pro-slavery constitution. From my reading of it, and Sean, correct me if I'm wrong, don't even really hold much of a vote, right?
No.
No. It's just a small. Go ahead.
Well, what happens is that the significantly larger anti-slavery forces also boycotted voting on their constitution.
Right.
And Buchanan, in one of his most boneheaded things ever, says, "Well, I didn't vote, so." That's it sounds like something Al Bundy would say in his dumber moments, So he that's what he is allowing this constitution to pass because his mind, like, well, we'll have a constitution. This will mollify the Southerners, and we can end this whole thing legalistically again. And by the way, I've got the votes. But here's the added bonus to this, right? If we ask James Buchanan and Stephen Douglas, who do you hate most in the world, they're going to name the other one.
Right.
I cannot explain the depths. I cannot. Here we go. So when Douglas comes out against the Lecompton Constitution, I think Buchanan then really goes, I really like this Constitution now. It must be the greatest.
I think you're right about that. I think you're right about that, actually.
So here's what happens. Douglas goes to meet with Buchanan to tell him that this is fraudulent. This is making a mockery of popular. Keep it in mind, though, Buchanan actually wasn't a fan of popular sovereignty to begin with, and he thought Stephen Douglas destroyed the Missouri Compromise and destroyed the Compromise of 1850. So he detested Douglas before this, and then of course he gave none of Douglas's people any positions in the cabinet when Douglas had made him, and actually Douglas said, "I made him, I'll break him." So Douglas goes in there. The meeting starts off rather calm, and it gets worse and worse and worse. And think about it: you've got two men, Buchanan, who is willful and arrogant, but also hates conflict. Simply follow his orders. You've got Douglas, who loves a fight. Douglas is like a second coming of Jackson in that regard. What did Jackson say? "I was born for a storm, and a calm does not suit me." So, as their discussion is collapsing, Buchanan says, "Mr. Douglas, I desire you to remember that no Democrat ever yet differed from administration of his own choice without being crushed. Beware the fate of Talmadge and Rives." These are two men who Jackson broke. All right? He destroyed those two men. And then Douglas shouts, "Mr. President, I wish you to remember that General Jackson is dead." Storms out and slams the door. So,
man.
And the reason Mark Summers believed this is it, because the Democratic Party is the two most powerful Democrats are now in an open war with each other politically.
Right.
And each one is calling the other one a traitor to the party.
Right. I wanted to add, because I had forgotten this detail, the Lecompton Constitution is even rejected by the territorial legislature of Kansas at this time, which is controlled by anti-slavery forces. Mm-hmm. So not only is Lecompton not representative of the Kansas public, the Lecompton Constitution is also not even sort of legally binding technically. From a pure sort of state territorial legal perspective as well, which is just wild. I always knew it was bogus. I didn't know how bogus it was. Wow,
and how little support it had in the state.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, but no, I mean, but I agree with you guys. Like that row between Douglas and Buchanan. I mean, the whole reason you get the Civil War is because the Democratic Party falls apart. Like, if they stayed together, Lincoln is not elected in 1860.
Yeah, John Bell and John Breckinridge, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
and Douglas.
yeah.
Oh man! So
I always wondered if
disaster.
D.C. would have legislated Kansas, what would have happened if D.C. would have legislated that versus the people.
Oh, if literally Congress did?
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting, right? Like, the problem is I don't know if there was a way to without causing a scandal one way or the other, right? Mm-hmm. Because if you declare it a slave state, I think white Northerners get just as radicalized over it as they did over bleeding Kansas. Same if you declare it a free state, actually.
Mm.
Yeah, like I
mean, does anybody have any more comments on Lecompton? Because I've got a few on what's happening in 1858 before John Brown happens.
Sure. Yeah, I think at least I'm pretty good on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm feeling good.
We're pretty. Yeah, it's fine.
Yeah. My summation of Lecompton in short is that this is easily ranked as one of the greatest political blunders of all time. It doesn't get much dumber than this, folks. So, and rarely has a party split like this in American history.
Given the fact that doing nothing was a completely viable option, yeah, it's pretty dumb.
Yeah, especially because he did nothing about the Panic
Buchanan's
of 57, but then he intervenes in the state affair and backs the far less powerful and popular side and insists that their shit be recognized, and then tries to bully/bribe the Senate to make it happen.
And then all while at the same time starting a war with the number 2 Democrat in the country who you've already angered. Right?
Yeah.
So, of course, 1858. These are not going to be good midterms for the Democratic Party. They are going to be pilloried now. Yeah, let me pull up the numbers on that one real quick.
Yeah, that'd be interesting.
Yeah. So, 1858. Ouch. There we go.
Oh, wow.
All right, I got them.
Yeah, huge numbers.
Yeah. So the Republicans gained 23 seats. The Democrats lose 49. People might be like, what does that mean? Well, there's the know-nothings. They're still around, but they're diminishing rapidly. And you have the opposition party, which is essentially the leftovers of the Whig Party in the South.
Oh, weird.
Stevens is their main guy because, up until the very end, Stevens tried to hold on to Whiggery the way that Buchanan tried to hold on to federalism back in the day. So you have the Republicans are now in charge of the House of Representatives. Do you have the Senators on? Do you have those as well? Let me see.
Yeah, let me see if I can find them.
Mm-hmm.
For 1858.
Yeah, it's on Wikipedia. That just pulled them up just now. Oh, that's a guy I never heard of, William Pennington. Huh. You think the first Republican Speaker of the House of Representatives? Well, I guess maybe Nathaniel Banks kind of was. Kinda. Anyway, let's see. Let me pull that one up right here.
Oh yeah, here we go.
So what is it looking like? I just got them as well.
Democrats
lose 4, Republicans gain 5.
Democrats lose 4 seats. Republicans gain 5. Know-nothings lose 2 seats. So It looks like the Republicans, unsurprisingly, pick up Minnesota, Iowa, Michigan, New Jersey, and Rhode Island. It looks like, yeah. And Democrats picked,
Kentucky and Tennessee.
Yep.
Yeah, because as we know, the Whig Party is dying, and that's those two. Kentucky in particular had strong Whig proclivities. So when I say dying, I mean it's effectively dead now. Just the leftovers getting brushed aside. So the House is now in the hands of the enemy, a party that, of course, he very, very much despises. I do want to find real quick something about the Lincoln Douglas debates. Now, Congress is going to be extremely hostile towards him because do you all know corruption in Buchanan's administration?
Not tons. No. What do you got on that?
Oh yeah. Oh no. He's got corruption because Buchanan. One of the reasons Grant had corruption is because if Grant liked you, he was going to look the other way about what you did, what you were doing. Okay. Now, what's going to happen is that what happens is that in the case of Buchanan, because he doesn't have a family life and he relies so much on his friends. I remember his best friend, King, has been dead for years, although they weren't as great close friends in the 1850s, but they were still friends, right? He is reluctant to part company with anybody in his cabinet. And remember, he's hanging out with these guys a lot. So there's corruption under Secretary of the Interior Thompson, but especially under John Floyd. And Floyd is going to, now the scandal breaks more in the 1860s, but the House actually starts investigating Buchanan when they come in 1859. And one of the things that Floyd did was that he banished Montgomery Meigs, who was looking into, was complaining about problems in the War Department. He banished him to the Dry Tortugas. Do you know where that is?
Oh my God, that's like way the hell out there, isn't it?
Oh yeah, this is beyond Key West. Okay, so to the west of Key West. Oh, the Dry Tortugas is where they is. Now he's sent there. Now Meigs is a great engineer. He of a fort. The Dry Tortugas, though, is the military prison of the U.S. Army with a very high death rate. So Floyd sent the guy, as Floyd said, I know I can't actually send you to jail, but I'm going to kind of send you to jail and hope you just die while you're working there. That's what Floyd does. Yeah. So Buchanan starts being investigated. By the way, by this time, he does have a nickname. He's being called James I because of his heavy-handed ways. Behind his back, other people go. Actually, I did find out that it was behind his back. He was called the Squire. Behind his back, he was also called the Grand Turk.
The Grand Turk.
Wow.
And
I'm assuming because he's totalitarian, right? Like that would be the charge.
Okay, I get it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And he tries to buy Cuba. That gets turned down. To try to mollify the North, he wanted an expansion of the tariff.
Okay. Makes sense.
That's turned down, right? You know what else that does too? Suddenly, people in South Carolina are like, whoa, you want to bring the tariff issue up again?
Gosh. I swear, South Carolinians are absolutely freaking insane. Craziest people in U.S. history.
Sir,
I'm sorry. I want to say South Carolinians, white South Carolinians. So let's really emphasize that.
You will not dishonor the great name of South Carolina, sir.
Hey, well, it is the only place I ever was driving through, and when I wasn't driving, I was riding with somebody, and we saw a billboard near this town. This is like, western tip of South Carolina. The sign said alien. This for the town. It said alien abduction free since 1993 or something. So please keep in mind, but South Carolina. Also, you got to keep in mind too. South Carolina and Rhode Island are the two of the least democratic states in the country at this time.
I was just about to say
by moneyed interests.
The number of times, if you guys go online, go to the 1858 U.S. House of Representative elections, you will see no data for 3 coastal South Carolina seats in terms of who voted, because no one did, because it's a freaking oligarchy.
100%.
South Carolina is a true oligarchy, and oligarchs care about, of course, naturally care about their money. I guess who doesn't, right? But think about it. Buchanan brings up the tariff issue, so that's one thing. Like, how can I anger the arguably the second state that is most fervently secessionist? Because I would say first is Florida. But only by a nose. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So here is another blunder for you, and both those go down in flames. Another one happens is that Buchanan vetoes the Homestead measure, and of course that is going to anger, first of all, the railroads, and he was supportive, of course, of the Transcontinental Railroad, but that angers the railroads, angers people in the North. All right. I do think, though, Buchanan actually had good criticism of the Homestead Act that was performed. He kind of said, the way this is written, it'll just be a land grab for rich people. He did essentially say that, in particular the railroads. He was president on that one. Give him credit there, So, yeah. But regardless of that, vetoing that bill, this makes him even more unpopular. And then you get the John Brown raid.
Yeah.
Anybody have comments on John Brown raid? I mean, he's not like, it's not saying that he's directly involved. He doesn't lead the troops in there, What you got?
I just think it if you want to look at why white Southerners really start to equate the Republican Party with abolitionism, it's the John Brown raid. I mean, arguably before as well, but I feel like white Southerners get more and more paranoid after the John Brown raid, because it's like, this rule under Republicans means slave rebellion. That's the sort of link that's made. And I think the other consequence of the John Brown raid is that what public opinion do white Southerners, especially in the Deep South, have of Northern public opinion? They don't have much. Like, Northern newspapers are banned down there. People are just reading straight up like
Echo
crazy.
Chambers?
Huh?
Echo chamber?
Yeah. I straight up think it's an echo chamber down there, and people are reading the most radical, nutty, pro-slavery stuff. And I think they are convinced that the Republican Party in 1860 has plans to basically launch a race war down there. They're convinced of that by secessionists. And the John Brown raid really does. I mean, I think it really does give their paranoia something to attach to, something tangible.
Yeah, I think they use it as propaganda without a doubt. Like every little nugget of abolition they could use to say, see, I told you. Like, even if it's 5 years span, 10 years span, like every little nugget they can link together as evidence to show, to demonstrate. It's like, oh, see, told you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, I think you make a good point there, without a doubt.
And I want to emphasize here, it's interesting to read the actual Republican platform of 1860, because the first thing they say in that platform, I think it's like the second or third thing. The first thing is like our principles as a party. But you get down to the first policy thing they say, we do not support any rebellions whatsoever, or any military action whatsoever in states. We disavow any attempt to use violence in order to overthrow slavery. Straight up. Announcing to the world, we do not support John Brown.
Absolutely.
But, is that Republican platform ever going to be published in the South? Absolutely not. No way. No. I mean, so it's...
Militia companies will spring up all over the South after this.
Oh, what?
Yeah. Militia companies will spring up all over the South after this. And that's one of the reasons why the Confederate Army is able to mobilize much faster than people thought at the time. Although we'll get to that one when we get there. I know we're still well, yeah, it's 10:15 over here.
I have those.
So,
I have that platform also, Michael. And that the Republicans, they also say they support states' rights.
Yeah.
They talk about wage labor. They talk about, not messing with slavery where it's located. Like they basically line up everything that they are seeking. But like you mentioned, it's not publicized in the South, and you have a group of Southerners who just refuse to believe it.
Yeah. And I really want to emphasize here, John Brown is not a hero in the North in 1859, right? Like, there are some abolitionists in the North who admire him, but your average Northerner does not like John Brown. He only becomes a hero later on when he's sort of thought of as a martyr after, 3-4 years of Civil War, when, white Northerners are so pissed off that they are, embracing emancipation.
And even then, John Brown's Body is not the most popular song with Union soldiers.
Right.
That's not a top 5 hit for them. Okay, so even though they're more sympathetic to him, he's never like seen as like a hero. They're more likely to sing like Battle Cry of Freedom or Columbia. They love that one. But anyways, let me see. Militia companies have sprung up everywhere. And 1858, of course, I know we're going back here a bit, all right? But you had your Lincoln-Douglas debates. Now, Douglas spent about half of the debates attacking Buchanan as much as Lincoln. And Henry Wise, who's governor of Virginia at this time, also he'll become a Confederate general. He is also going to plant a big knife in Buchanan's back, but Wise at this point is one of Buchanan's unofficial advisors, and he says that if Douglas succeeds without the aid of the administration, it is the rebuke of the administration. If Douglas is defeated with the opposition of Buchanan, it will be the death of the administration. And if he is successful with the aid of the administration, it might save the Democratic Party. That, of course, doesn't happen. And that leads into the Charleston Convention. So now Buchanan, one thing to know about Buchanan, he had said straight up, I'm not running for a second term.
Right.
He said that day one. All right. He's an older man. He figures that he only got in the tank for one. All right. So he already said that. So that, by the way, was another political mass calculation, because what does that mean? It means that everybody is like, every major Democrat's like, hey, this is my chance, right?
Yeah.
Right.
So this that only exacerbated the political problem that's going to happen. Now, fire eaters who were in Charleston, they despise Douglas, and when Douglas is going to be nominated, they simply stage a walkout. If only one delegation walked out, it would have been one thing. Enough of them walk out. This was, of course, orchestrated by William Butler Yancey. I still need to read his biography just because I consider him he's not something people talk about as much, but I consider him as important as John Brown in many ways to making this happen. Because those fire eaters, they failed in 1850 miserably. And Yancey did a very good job of making sure that they were in correspondence with each other. And he's the one who conceives that strategy where he says, if you get all these southern politicians in a room and you say, let's secede, and one's from Mississippi and one's from Louisiana, another from Texas, they're not going to do it. They're not going to do it. He says, what we need to do is make one state secede, defy the government, and force the other ones to do it as well. And Yancey sees his opportunity here. The fractures the Democratic Party and the weakness of Buchanan. So this is his ploy. And as far as like a political maneuver, this is a brilliant operation. Right? He's going to force the Charleston Convention to collapse, where Douglas is denounced as a traitor by many on the floor, a traitor to the Democratic Party. So you're going to get the, by the way, really didn't help things. Buchanan's close allies at this time, like John Slidell and Howell Cobb, were not able to attend because of administration business they were carrying out.
Huh.
If there was any chance of that being headed off, you would have needed somebody like Cobb there.
Mm.
And at that point, Cobb is not favoring disunion. So maybe maybe Cobb could have done something, but Cobb wasn't there, so he wasn't. So that was a major mistake on Buchanan's part as well.
Huh.
And what's here? 3. Let me see. There we go. I keep that in mind. Okay, so now you have a 4-way race for the presidency. Lincoln was after a very contested convention. Lincoln is nominated in large part because his people promised Simon Cameron a plum position in the new administration. You'll have John C. Breckinridge put up by the Southerners. By the way, Breckinridge was lied to. Breckinridge was told the whole point they're running you is simply to scare the party into dropping Douglas.
Huh?
Breckinridge was played for a fool. All right.
Huh.
Then you have John Bell.
And I wanted to say really quick about on the Republican side, Seward, who will eventually become Secretary of State, is considered the front runner, and is also considered more radical.
Yeah, he was too radical for the Republican Party. Yeah.
Yeah, the speech where he said irrepressible conflict. He made that speech in 1859, I believe.
Yeah.
Lincoln was considered the moderate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think that's important context here, right? The peoples of the secessionists are going to define as this crazy radical who's going to go and cause abolitionism and slave rebellions and stuff is like the moderate Republican.
The whole thing.
The propaganda machine's good.
It is good. It's still working, but you're right. It's completely, because Lincoln was definitely if you know anything about him, he supported annexation and deportation and a lot of other stuff. So yeah, you're right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and something else to keep in mind too. Even one of the things that really depresses Democrats is like when they get the final tally together, like, even if Douglas and Breckinridge had made up, Lincoln was still going to win.
Yeah,
I say Douglas and Breckinridge make up. It wasn't like Douglas hated Breckinridge. Breckinridge was being, essentially being used. Douglas famously during this said Douglas wouldn't drop out. Too proud for that. But then he says, "I'm going south to try to rally unionism."
Huh.
And by his side is Stevens. And he's going all over the American South, making speeches saying, you must stay loyal to the Union, do not do secession, this is folly. And of course, he's being jeered everywhere, things thrown at him. And this is also the reason why Douglas is, in 1860, is also when he returns and talks to other politicians, especially ones who are being blithe about it, like, I don't think anything will happen. He's telling them, look, you idiots, the Southerners are adamant. They are going to secede, right? And keep it in mind, too, the fervor for this depends on where you are. But Lincoln gets elected. I've got a few choice quotes for you. One Georgia politician said, "The voice of the North has proclaimed to the ballot box that I should be a slave. At the same time, I hear the voice of God command, be free, be free." Lawrence Kett, who is a major South Carolina politician, big-time fire eater, South Carolina will either leave the Union or else throw arms around the pillars of the Constitution and involve all the states in common ruin. Mr. Buchanan has pledged to secession and will be held to it. And John Slidell, here's where the knife comes in. He writes personally to Buchanan, "I deeply regret the embarrassments which will surround you during the remainder of your term. I need scarcely say that I will do everything in my power to modify them and to arrest any hostile action during your administration. I see no possibility of preserving the Union, nor indeed do I consider it desirable." So Slidell says, I'm going to break up the Union. I'm going to help break up the Union now. You're going to have a hard time for it. I get a hard time of it. So long, sucker. and uh, and I would want to mention another one too. In the middle of all this, because I wrote a book about him. PGT Beauregard was writing. God, he's so politically dumb. He says, "I think Breckinridge will win. The Union will hold together, and Slidell will keep Louisiana in the Union."
Oh God!
And he's
wow.
Yeah, politically, always Breckinridge. Beauregard is politically clueless. I just thought when I read his analysis of politics in 1860, I was like, this is the worst, and this is the worst, most incorrect analysis of anybody in the contemporary scene.
Right.
But he's too busy working on the Customs House, I guess. Anyways, so
don't forget about John C. Fremont, also, guys. Fremont.
Oh, what about him? What about Mr. Fremont?
Yeah, remember that he ran as he was a Republican. Remember that he ran against in 56.
That's right. Free. Yeah, he was the free soil, free labor, Fremont. Yeah. There we go. Yeah.
There you.
So
not a bad slogan.
I know where. Not a bad slogan at all. Did very well considering it's a very new party, and they still have to compete with the Know Nothings or the Nativist Party or National Party, however you want to put it. Anyway, so and now we get to the fact that Buchanan is a despised lame duck, and there's a secession crisis.
Yeah, the South, they used them up.
And this is all right. So,
secession crisis.
Let me see something.
Feel more the Know Nothing Party.
So I have so this is pretty much going to be concluding things to go over Fort Sumter. What happens in the Buchanan administration during this is there is a lot of debate on what exactly happened in many cases. In no small part because many of the principal men involved will be in Lincoln's administration and will be looking to throw blame on Buchanan.
Which, fair.
That also means they want to throw blame on Buchanan so they don't get blamed for their own mistakes.
Well, of course, but I mean, when you do 90% of the actions that lead to the immediate causes of the Civil War, you might get 110% of the blame.
I actually have Buchanan's a terrible president. I have a lot more sympathy for him at this phase.
Fair enough. Well, let's talk about it.
I guess we could talk about.
He put himself here, right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess we could
the
talk
race
about
to the bottom.
Yeah, I guess we could talk about like how there actually was a fairly strong tradition of at least having some sympathy for Buchanan up to about 1945, like that historiographical tradition.
There was a bit. I mean, don't get me wrong. The guy was never beloved. Here's what's happening though. Buchanan, the maneuvers he's making is an attempt to avoid war. So a few things that are going to happen. For instance, he is, let me see, I'm going to start with this one. Okay, so amongst the Republicans, Lincoln is siding with the more radical faction of the party insofar as they are saying there should be no compromise. Because you're going to have a lot of people at this time scrambling around, most notably John Crittenden of Kentucky, trying to have a new compromise convention to head this off. Right. Buchanan himself at one point will try to call a constitutional convention. And remember that whole thing about the pig war in Oregon? There's even some people who think, let's try to start, and Seward does this for a bit, let's try to start a war with Britain, because North and South, we agree we don't like the British, and let's go take Canada.
I love it.
So, let me see. All right. So it's happening to, this is, a lot of people consider this to be one of the big mistakes Abraham Lincoln makes, is that Lincoln decides the South is not actually that serious about secession and says, we'll just call their bluff, like Jackson did with South Carolina before.
Right.
Douglas is very much telling everybody, no, they're dead serious. Increasingly, so is Buchanan. So Buchanan's strategy is to try to deflate the situation as much as possible. That's what he's trying to do right now. And that explains a lot of the erratic actions that he's going to take as well. Let me see.
Also, now, Sean, don't forget, Buchanan was flaming the fires also. He made some pretty inflammatory speeches as well. Like Buchanan, toward the end of his term, he was making some very inflammatory speeches about Black men being rapists and arson, because arson was a big thing in antebellum United States, where enslaved people would burn down stuff. So he would make some very instigative speeches. I don't, he didn't bow out oh sorry, tiptoed out, but he was kind of stoking the flames quite a bit.
Okay. I'll admit I don't know. I'll admit I don't know about those speeches. So
yeah, he promoted a very southern. He promoted a very
yeah, but I'm going to go over his actions during the Fort Sumter crisis itself right now.
Yeah.
So what's going to happen is, first off, Douglas had his faction Democratic Party voting with the Republicans on numerous issues, hence the calls of "you're a traitor to the Democratic Party." Douglas makes it clear to Lincoln, here's the quote, "All government is coercion, and I go in for asserting this principle at every hazard. Rather, 1 million men should fall on the battlefield than this government should lose one single state." So another thing is also going to give Lincoln the impetus he has is that he knows that the leader of a significant faction of the Democratic Party is going to back him in this case. Now, so Lincoln says, no compromise. Buchanan makes it clear that if there is no compromise, there will be a war. Now, in the case of Fort Sumter, he knows that's the big flashpoint. The big problem he has is he can send no more than 300 men there. Now, I'm a big fan of Winfield Scott. I think he's the best U.S. general, but he does not do well during this. He's also really old. His health is failing. Yeah, and Scott, the problem with Scott is that Scott doesn't properly mobilize the military during this. Scott, like Beauregard, is kind of like, I think this will blow over, So Scott himself is also advising Buchanan, I think we'll be fine down there. And then he's like, well, we're in trouble. I can only send 300 men. That's not going to do anything down there, except have more mouths to feed.
Right.
So Cobb decided he was going to leave as soon as Lincoln's elected. Cobb stays on for another month, though. Because this thing about Cobb is, remember, Cobb had been a Unionist, right? Mm-hmm. He's now going to flip. And the belief is that how Cobb flipped because he said, they're going to secede in Georgia anyway. I want to get in on that right now to keep my political power and to maneuver himself to be president of the Confederacy. Because what Buchanan's strategy is at this point is he knows South Carolina's leaving. What he thinks is that as long as he can keep North Carolina and Georgia, South Carolina is geographically isolated. But then Cobb says later, moves down to Georgia, supports secession. All right. So that is the big betrayal that happens. Then the grave miscalculation about the personality of Howell Cobb. Howell Cobb was a very good politician, but Howell Cobb, one of the reasons he doesn't become president of the Confederacy is because he'd only joined the secession movement late, but he already had a bit of a reputation as a political opportunist, which you see on full display here. So that one's done. I already read about John Slidell. So John Slidell, the most powerful Louisiana politician, is now going to try to work for Louisiana to get out of the Union. And Cass is disgusted by Buchanan's inaction, so he leaves. But here's what's funny about Cass. I didn't know this. So Cass resigns. People were like, that was a heroic stand. No, it wasn't. The next day, Cass said, can I have my job back? And Buchanan just said, get the hell out of here, which don't blame him on that one. And so then you have the mission that Thompson is sent on. This one's weird. I'm going to read this out, and I just want to get everybody's opinion on what this is. Because when I read this one, I was like, what the hell is he expecting from Thompson? So Thompson was associated with Mississippi, which is moving towards secession. Mississippi appointed him as an agent to visit North Carolina. Now, this is what's written here. To discuss the secession movement, Thompson asks for Buchanan's approval of the mission, offering to resign if the president opposed his going. Buchanan suffered heavy condemnation at the time and for years afterward for allowing Thompson to make this journey while he was still a member of the cabinet, for it outwardly appeared as if the president were actively promoting the secession movement. Buchanan later explained that it was the belief that Thompson was going to go on the mission to prevent them from seceding.
Huh.
Bizarre maneuver on that one.
Huh.
But he's getting more and more desperate. It is around this time that Buchanan is now openly being called a traitor. Now, at the same time, Floyd's flip-flopping about secession. You know, he sends Major Don Carlos Buell, who will later on become an important Union general, to go to Fort Sumter, and they're given instructions to hold the fort. Fort Moultrie. And then Anderson is going to retreat from Moultrie to Fort Sumter. Now, at the same time, Buchanan is looking to get rid of Floyd because of because of the corruption that's occurred. And let me get to this next page here. So, the movement to Fort Sumter causes a flood of senators to bombard Buchanan. Jefferson Davis comes and has a very testy exchange. Remember, the two men weren't particularly fond of each other to begin with. So Jefferson Davis and a bunch of other Southern senators go in there and say, you must order Anderson back to Fort Moultrie, where essentially he would be disarmed. Around this time, because Buchanan doesn't order him back around this time, we're going to get to that in a sec, though, because there's some controversy on what he does afterwards, a bunch of Southerners decide that Buchanan is against them. Buchanan said, the secession is illegal, but I do not have the power to coerce a state back into the Union. The most milquetoast opinion you can have.
Yep.
But the fact that he doesn't back secession, because remember, Lawrence Kett said he's got our back. He doesn't support secession, and he doesn't come out and immediately order Anderson back to Fort Moultrie, means that a bunch of Southerners now think he's against them. So a lot of these guys turn against him. And one senator named Wigfall. Now, do you guys know anything about Wigfall, Louis Wigfall?
No.
He is one of the most loud, bombastic, and aggressive senators of this era. I want to say this, during the actual firing on Fort Sumter in 1861, he actually rode out to the fort to try to get him to surrender during the fighting. That's the kind of guy you're dealing with here. Well, he didn't row, he had his slave row him. But anyways, Wigfall gets drunk on Christmas Day and hatches a scheme to, get this, kidnap Buchanan and make Breckinridge president.
Cool.
Wow.
Sobers up.
Yeah.
Yeah. Louis Wigfall is a truly vicious man. His contemporaries thought he was bombastic and mean, and he was. So, let me see. Present. And then Jeremiah Black, by this time, is becoming the guy that Buchanan is leaning on. All right? Now, they have this cabinet meeting. Floyd asserts that the government pledges have been violated and that federal troops should be withdrawn from all the Charleston forts. At the same time, Floyd had ordered a lot of extra weapons down south, knowing they would be seized during this time. So he's helping arm the Confederacy. Right? And Black, with the order signed by Floyd, waved them in his hand and said, there never was a moment in the history of England when a minister of the crown could have proposed to surrender a military post which might be defended without bringing his head to the block. He screamed that at him. Yeah. So what happens is, in an attempt, what happens now is Buchanan is about to order Anderson to go back to Fort Moultrie, because he was waiting for a response from Lincoln and I think another politician about that constitutional convention, and he thinks, if I do that, I can deflate the situation a few more days. However, then Black and the rest of the new cabinet will reject this. And so then Buchanan's course is going to be to hold the forts. Now, as far as the new cabinet goes, pulling them up right here, you have Joseph Holt, Secretary of War, John Dix is the Treasury, Attorney General is Edwin Stanton, and as far as Stanton goes, Buchanan does have one of the best insults about Stanton. Stanton, a man I truly despise. Buchanan said of Stanton, he was always on my side, complained. He was always on my side. He complained, and this is when he said, and flattered me ad nauseum. Look, Stanton favors whoever's in power. That's why he spent his whole political career jumping from faction to faction. He could smell who was in charge, and he would flatter them to death and do whatever they wanted, which is why he becomes Abraham Lincoln's hatchet man. So at this point, there is some Republicans who are saying, why don't we have that why don't we do a compromise, have Crittenden do it? In particular, William Seward and Thurlow Weed. Thurlow Weed's like the kind of political operator of New York. He's the editor of the Albany Evening Journal, at that time a major newspaper. Lincoln says no. And then you have the Star of the West incident. So they try to resupply Anderson, who's in Fort Sumter. The Star of the West is fired upon in Charleston Harbor. Buchanan at this point does nothing. So for a period of time, once Buchanan says, no, Anderson, you hold Fort Sumter. He tells him to hold Fort Sumter. For a period of time, the newspaper started to go like, Buchanan's not so bad. Then he doesn't do anything after the Star of the West is fired on. But Buchanan rightfully says, what do you want me to do? I don't have any troops here.
So I read some different stuff on this that I kind of want to answer, because this question of the forts and the federal forts in the South seems pretty important for determining.
What do you think? I said, what do you think? I mean, as in, like, you think so?
Well, so I have this article, and actually, this article is by Gene Baker, so there's a different sort of opinion on it. But
yes,
but Baker does point out some interesting things that she found here that argue a little bit of a different story. So she goes over the federal forts in the South that Buchanan declines to defend effectively. And there's a lot. So it's we talked about Fort Moultrie, Castle Pinckney, and Charleston. There are others though. You have Fort Pulaski in Georgia. You have Forts Jackson, Phillips, and Pike in Louisiana, and in New Orleans and Baton Rouge, that are seized by both Georgia troops and Louisiana militia forces. Sometimes they're seized even before the secession vote takes place, actually.
In a few cases, yes. Wise in particular does that in Virginia.
Yeah, and then that
happens later. That happens later, though. Anyway.
Yeah, and then there's Florida militia seizing the Pensacola Navy Yard, and a Little Rock Arsenal in Arkansas being seized as well. And then a general in the U.S. Army, David Twiggs, simply surrendering all of his military units to a local militia in Texas.
General Twiggs.
yeah, there you go. There's General Twiggs.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, you cut. I'm sorry. I didn't hear what you said because it cut off. So when you said that, my bad. Keep going, man.
Yeah. So there's a bunch of different things, and here's the other aspect of this. And so this is something Baker finds. She says that Winfield Scott twice recommended to the president the immediate garrison of all these forts that were seized to deter any attempt to take over. And Buchanan disagrees, but then Scott writes in October of 1860 saying that no, there are specifically 5 regiments that could be immediately deployed. Here they are. Why don't you send them? And so this excuse that there's no troops, I don't necessarily believe Buchanan on that. I mean, unless Scott is simply wrong about that.
What I read was that they had deployed a number of troops elsewhere prior to the Sumter crisis, and so there were very few troops available.
Yeah, but Scott seems like he's saying that there are 5 regiments that could be deployed to garrison these forts. and he's recommending it to Buchanan in October of 1860.
But can they get to Fort Sumter?
I don't know if they can get to Fort Sumter, but I think he's talking about the other. So Dean, I think, is talking about the other forts that are taken over in December and January throughout in Georgia and Florida and all those other places.
Yeah, because I want to say
because he's trying to avoid a war.
I'll say
the garrisons them, it's a war.
Yeah, because I want to say the problem with deployment was that the troops weren't near a harbor. So I want to say the troops that they did have available, Scott was mostly looking at troops who were near the harbor of New York, if I remember correctly. So to be able to ship.
Or also that, yeah, and also ones in, I believe, in Missouri as well, that could be deployed by the rivers. But the thing is that Scott's telling him that Buchanan's not going to do it because he's intent right now on trying to avoid the war. That's his plan. That's what he's trying to do. He knows if he sends those troops, it's war.
And it's worth to point out there's consequences to that. So Freeling writes that 75,000 stands of arms are confiscated by U.S. forts and arsenals in December and January, right? So, you can try to avoid war, and while he's trying to quote-unquote avoid war, the Confederacy is effectively arming itself before it becomes its own seceded nation.
But that's through Floyd, who doesn't tell him that he's sending all the weapons there.
I mean, there's some of that, true. But, I don't know. I mean, there's I feel like there's a fine line here between trying to keep the peace and we're simply refusing to defend federal property from militias.
That will be a point of disagreement for us. I simply think that he knows that he can do that. But remember, he's being told this on October 29th. That's when I believe that letter was sent.
Yeah.
And by that time, Buchanan himself says, I wish you had informed me earlier. I don't entirely trust Buchanan on that one, though.
Right.
But look at what the objective is. His objective at this point is he's trying to avoid a war. He knows if he sends those troops to garrison those forts, it's war. And he has multiple flashpoints, not just Fort Sumter and also Fort Pickens. We forgot to mention that one because, you can make a case that even if they evacuate Fort Sumter, you're still going to get a war because of Pickens.
Sure.
In fact, in some ways, there's evidence that Seward would prefer the war to start in Pickens for some. I forgot for which reason though. But anyways, they're going to have one that is. So that's his objective. He knows that if he sends those troops there, they're going to be attacked and it's war. So that's his thing, trying to avoid war at this point.
And I guess this is the question that might be even worth discussing. Is that naive at this point? Is there any actual case that you're not going to have a civil war by October, November 1860?
You could I would say it's a long shot. And naive, I could say that too. Right? I guess my point is that I believe a war should be avoided as much as possible. And you exhaust all your options, and then you only do this if you have none. Buchanan is exhausting all of his options. Now, what I would say is that Buchanan has gotten himself into this mess, and he is not a man who's going to be capable of getting out of it. I will, however, in that regard, understand why he's doing what he's doing.
And I want to really contrast this because I feel like it is really it's a stark contrast. He deploys lots of naval ships, a navy, literally, to Paraguay at the Pig War, right? That is over the killing of one U.S. sailor. I'm just saying this. One fucking U.S. sailor dies. He's like, mobilize the fucking Navy. Here we go. We're going to Paraguay. And meanwhile, Scott's screaming at him in October of 1860, you're not going to defend federal property from militias? You're just going to let these fire-eating secessionists have it before they even vote on secession? I mean, the contrast between Buchanan's policies here is wild.
Yeah, it is pretty nuts. Also, the invasion of Paraguay, if not for the larger looming Civil War, I mean, that's got to be one of the strangest foreign policy decisions of all time.
Yeah.
You also have another problem, though, here. Remember, Michael, his he's been afraid of disunion for decades.
Sure.
So he does not want to be the author of the final act that causes it to happen.
It's just
So
remarkable.
that's why you're going to get, it's remarkable that a man this bellicose, I know, is being this not circumspect's the wrong word, cautious perhaps.
Yeah.
Anyway, you were going to say, Michael?
I was also going to say it's just remarkable that someone who's so afraid of disunion is also so incurious and so arrogant that he can kind of prevent it. Like, usually people who are afraid of something try to learn more about it to try to forestall it, right? As opposed to just think that always what they're doing is exactly correct. It's a very bizarre set of personality traits, is what I'll say.
I don't know if I would say he's necessarily, I don't know about incurious at this point, but I'd have to mull that over and maybe get back to you on that one. I would say that there's another reason too, because I had a similar thought that you did. Like, wait, this guy, the super bellicose foreign policy, is trying to avoid war, like he's like Neville Chamberlain, or I could name a variety of people. But I think I found the answer.
And what is that?
Okay, so first off, Lincoln gets inaugurated. So I'm just going to mention just this real quick as I'm creating a timeline here, right? So Lincoln's inaugurated, and of course, and famously, Buchanan said, "My dear sir, if you're as happy in entering the White House as I shall feel in returning to Wheatland, you are a happy man indeed." So they had a nice cordial conversation. He leaves. Lincoln essentially continues Buchanan's policy. In fact, the book by Philip Klein actually does an analysis of Lincoln's first inaugural that shows that he actually says a bunch of stuff Buchanan already said, but in a much more eloquent way. A fun thing about the reactions to the first inaugural, it's Republicans loved it, Democrats hated it, but one editor in particular said, if a neutral editor said the Republicans would have hated it though if Buchanan, Cass, or Douglas had made the speech, and then Klein's argument is that essentially Douglas had made the first inaugural address in a bunch of other speeches, but the thing that Buchanan does he back the war effort? Yes. Wholeheartedly. However, May of 1861, Buchanan makes a statement, and he says, "It is going to be a long, bloody war, and the Confederates are going to fight hard." And he is denounced, burned in effigy, and declared to be a defeatist, because everybody knows Southerners can't fight. But that's why. Buchanan actually, in one of the only pieces of really good analysis judgment that he made this time, had already deduced that he essentially told people, "I've been around these Southerners long enough to know this. They will fight you tooth and nail." Which, by the way, is also why during the war, when Lincoln proposes the draft, Buchanan says, "All for it. You need to pull all the soldiers you can in to crushing the Confederacy." When the Democrats say the draft is unconstitutional, Buchanan actually writes it's perfectly constitutional. In 1864, when you have the Democrats running somebody for president, Buchanan says it's useless, and by the way, I hope Lincoln wins. And furthermore, he repeatedly told the Democrats, he said, "Forget any talk of peace. Never mention peace. You have to have unconditional surrender."
Wow.
Buchanan, during the Civil War, is a hardliner, actually, for the conflict. The only thing that he came out against was, of course, emancipation. But otherwise, he essentially, and this is despite the fact that Lincoln's people said, yeah, Buchanan was inept, and a lot of them said, yeah, it's Buchanan's fault this happened. And it's often said that one of the reasons Lincoln had guys like Holt and Stanton working for him was that way that men who had been involved with Buchanan could then also denounce him. So in other words, you put the blame for the war actually starting on Buchanan's shoulders and make sure the Republicans are not held to attempt for it. And not just that, there was actually a motion in Congress late in 1862 to try to bring Buchanan up on charges of treason. It went absolutely nowhere, of course.
Right.
But I mean, he's constantly being attacked in newspapers, and despite what is actually a smear campaign, because I don't think Buchanan's a traitor. Throughout all of this, Buchanan is steadfast in his support for the war and essentially a hardline policy on the war. So that's why I think he's trying to forestall it. I think he'd already deduced what it was going to be in a way that, honestly, Lincoln didn't. Because Lincoln's very much one of those guys who's like, yeah, we just 75,000 volunteers and we'll just march into Richmond and it's all over. Buchanan himself said after Bull Run, he's like, yeah, I saw this coming. You're going to need way more men.
Yeah.
You're going to need a lot more soldiers. So, and also one last thing on that one. This is a contrast with Franklin Pierce, because Pierce was openly against the war and Lincoln's handling of it. Right. So, Pierce was treated with disregard by Lincoln, including having a clerk inquire Pierce if he was a traitor or not, which Pierce said, I'm a former president. You don't send a clerk to address me. Right? And also, fun as I mentioned, is that when Lincoln's son died in 1862, Pierce had also lost a child on the way to the White House, wrote Lincoln a letter saying, I know we have differences, but I understand this. I'm very sorry for your loss. Lincoln writes nothing back. And also a mob formed outside Pierce's home to attack him after Lincoln died. Now, Buchanan was often denounced and pilloried, but for instance, he gave a significant part of his fortune to raising Union soldiers during the war as well. By the way, funny enough, Simon Cameron, because remember Simon Cameron hates Buchanan, said he merely did that to keep the mob from hanging him. But that's just not true.
No, I mean, given that you have that sort of previous history of him actually being personally quite charitable, that doesn't seem accurate.
And also the fact that he supports the war effort almost
to
the hilt.
Sure.
So that's I might write a little bit more on that, because I was surprised, I guess because I'd already done stuff on Pierce. I was surprised. I thought Buchanan coming on these attacks and what he did before the war, that he would not be one of these kind of guys. He would not be somebody who would be saying things like, oh, the draft, thank God you're doing this. You need more soldiers.
Yeah.
So
that's an interesting history.
That is quite fascinating too, and probably the only thing that people have given Buchanan credit for is expanding the Navy and actually calling in more ships away from, as the secession, as things are getting out of control in 1860, he expands the home fleet. That's one of the reasons why the U.S. Navy, after Fort Sumter, is able to act fairly quickly. And if the U.S. Navy had fallen into very bad disrepair for a while, and Buchanan was overseeing a major shipbuilding programs, he expanded the fleet. So that, if anybody's ever asked me like, what's Buchanan's one accomplishment, I'll be like, he put the U.S. Navy on a good footing for that war.
That's fair.
Yes, sir. That's all I got, guys. Okay. But anyway, so, oh man, any new Buchanan lose? All right, and I end my part of this with one thing: is after the war, of course, during the war and after, Buchanan worked on his memoirs. He believed history would vindicate him. It generally has not. There was a period of time where he was treated as somebody who had no real chance to end the war, and maybe a character of sympathy and even pity. But I will give Buchanan the last words on pity, okay? Because after the war, what does Howell Cobb do? Now, remember, Howell Cobb never became president of the Confederacy. He had a rather poor military career. Georgia gets destroyed. So Cobb did what he did to gain more political power and ends up losing quite a bit. And Cobb comes north, I think 1867 or 68, to beg for a pardon. He personally comes, right? And he says, I would like to meet my old friend Buchanan. And Buchanan wrote, I do not wish to meet him now or hereafter. I wish him well and hope he may obtain his pardon, but this is all. I truly pity him.
Well, that's a pretty polite way to tell him to go fuck himself.
Having read enough Buchanan words, I'm going to tell you guys right now, this is the Buchanan equivalent of "go fuck yourself."
Right, right.
Buchanan does not write in strong language. This is very. When I was reading all these quotes by him, and maybe occasionally like an insult, like when he said that Stanton flattered him ad nauseum. But when you get to this one, I was like, ooh, man, having read what I've read of Buchanan's words, this is ice cold. This is. But I would also have to say to Buchanan, you were fool enough to trust him all the way until he resigned.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
Howell Cobb.
So now that's Howell Cobb.
I mean, it does sound like the name of somebody who would be a small-time crook, though. I mean, let's face it.
Oh God, he had a relative who died at Fredericksburg, who was a fire eater himself.
So, should we sort of talk about legacy, or I was curious, Thersites or Monica, if you guys had thoughts on the sort of latter part of Buchanan's presidency, which Sean talked about.
Yeah, legacy-wise, when it comes to Buchanan and I guess Andrew Johnson, it's kind of like the race to the bottom, as they say. I mean. I look back, like I said, I kind of view James Buchanan through the lens of the things that he could have done, which probably isn't fair to his legacy. But several times, like I mentioned prior, things could have been prevented. So Georgia and Mississippi threatened to succeed, if Kansas wasn't a slave state. Several times, I think he could have, I don't want to say he could have stopped the Civil War, because at some point, it was inevitable, but I do think he could have used his powers a little bit more aggressively. I think he was too concerned of pacifying the southern states. I think he was appeasing the South, like I mentioned earlier, simply because, in his opinion, he had the power. Jefferson Davis wanted a national slave code. He thought that at this time, Jefferson Davis thought that slavery followed the flag. I don't think that was necessarily a fact. So I think overall, like I said, viewing him through the things that he could have done better, I don't think it does well for his reputation, his historical reputation. I mean, and of course, when you have Lincoln coming right after you, he gets overshadowed.
Oh yeah, he's yes. I would also for me, his legacy is what happens when you have a narrow party focus, and within your party a factional focus as well. They're not a one for one, but this I was thinking George W. Bush on several things with Buchanan. I think they have some interest. I think they do have certain kinds of similarities, and it's the same thing. They were narrowly partisan focused, favored one particular faction of their party as well.
Yep.
Massive political miscalculations, but one of the ones that really strikes me is that the personal failings. So look at Franklin Pierce. What do you want to say about Pierce? Pierce was somebody who was very good at getting along. His cabinet didn't resign when he was there. He had many lifelong friends, and I find Pierce very fascinating too. And he had a very sad life in many ways, especially after presidency. I mean, God, he found Hawthorne dead in his bed, and that was his best friend. But I'm looking at Buchanan, and I'm stunned at just how many failures there are, such as trusting Howell Cobb, not knowing that John Floyd is shipping guns down there, allowing a snake like Stanton into your cabinet. I mean, the list just goes on and on of all these personal failings, and I think some of that might date back to failed courtship with Ann Coleman, his own cold relationship with his father. Buchanan And once again, he could actually host good parties. People liked going to the parties he would host. People came to his home in Pennsylvania all the time, not just because of his political power, but they said, yeah, he had good wine and cigars, right? So, he knows how to host a party for that time period, right? Doesn't mean you know how to talk to people or understand even who you're talking to. And I'm sometimes critical of Lincoln simply because I feel like he's been deified, and that kind of annoys me. But one thing Lincoln's really good at is the opposite of that. Lincoln is good at reading people, is good at talking to people, is good at putting understanding people. That is one of his expert qualities, and Buchanan is just utterly lacking in that.
I mean, I think it's very interesting because both Buchanan and Lincoln are profoundly concerned with the Constitution. They are both very lawyerly, right? Like, they're both very detailed in terms of their readings of the Constitution, and of laws generally. But Lincoln is a little bit more open-minded in terms of listening to other people's perspectives and incorporating them. Buchanan seems like, I mean, and I saw this from a lot of different authors in this sort of compilation of essays I was reading about Buchanan. He seems very close-minded in terms of his interpretations. He feels like he knows how to sort of properly interpret what executive powers are, and no one else does effectively. And I think the interesting thing about Buchanan, if you went and asked him and said, "Hi, hey, James Buchanan, are you a learned, open-minded, conversant man?" He would probably say, "Yeah, absolutely," right? But he surrounds himself with ideological sycophants, and he has a very particular point of view. And so, you get to to the secession crisis, and Buchanan is thinking he is on the small middle path. That's the only way that he's going to prevent the war, right? And everyone looks at him and sees him, way off. Basically, they think he is ideological, that he's closed-minded, that he's not listening to a word that he says. And meanwhile, he in his own mind is perfectly steering the ultimate sort of middle path. And I don't know, I just think he sort of has a very interesting combination of being uniquely detailed, clearly not a dumb person, but very naive and very sort of closed off and not realizing it.
I think the Southern states. I think the Southern states used him. I do. I think they used him. I think if he would have stood up to them, and reading the documents from the Southern states who chose to succeed, they see themselves as this new spirit of 1776. If you read Wisdom, they controlled him. He didn't have much of a backbone when it came to the Southern senators. And as a result, we know what happened.
I think, I don't know about, well, I do think they used him, definitely. I don't know about the lack of backbone. I think he was doing what he wanted to do. The thing that really strikes me, one to add to both of those, last thing I'm adding is that it is quite telling that I ran into several politicians reading the Klein book who mentioned Buchanan is more stubborn than Jackson. Think about that for a second.
Is that possible?
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, Jackson's a lot more flexible.
Yeah. I agree with that.
Yeah. But think about it too, though. But Jackson also had his stubbornness, right? And he's one of the more stubborn presidents. But I've come to the conclusion that Buchanan might be the most stubborn. And I think, Michael, also I agree with you on this one, mulling it over. A lack of curiosity. Another thing he actually shares with George W. Bush, a lack of curiosity.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like they don't necessarily choose to be, how do I say this, within the ideological sort of worlds that they end up acting in. He doesn't actively choose those worlds, but he just kind of lets them, like George W. Bush, he kind of lets himself just be swept into their sort of ideological points of views without realizing it's happening.
And I think for both of them, it actually stems from the same need for social acceptance. Because with Buchanan, all his friends were Southern senators like Rufus, Senator Rufus, I think was his name, or was it Rufus King? Either way. That senator from Alabama, they became
William.
best
I think it was William King.
William King.
I think it was William Rufus King.
There we go.
Yeah.
So anyway, like these were his friends. He modeled Wheatland after a Southern plantation in terms of its style. So he very much identified with them culturally and in terms of those were his friends. I mean, those were the people who accepted him and gave his life some company and merriment. Just like with George W. Bush.
Yeah.
I mean, he probably had some imposter syndrome because he clearly was not the most accomplished of H.W.'s sons. But he was the oldest, so he got the run first. And he knew he would need experienced advisors. Most of the Republican Party at that time was dominated by neocons. He surrounded himself with these guys who'd been his dad's buddies from the presidency and from his time at the CIA. And then these guys just told him what was what about the world, and off he went.
Needed validation.
Yeah, I'd say the big difference between the two is that I would say Buchanan's actually a lot more intelligent than George W. Bush.
I was going to say the same thing, man.
Fool me once, shame on me. Fool me twice.
Can't fool me again. Yeah, but I mean, Buchanan, though, I think is more dangerous, and just because of, I think with Bush, I wouldn't call him a humble man by any stretch of the imagination, but I think he was aware that there were limitations to his understanding of different things. I don't get the sense Buchanan had any awareness that there were things he didn't know.
I think if you're going to talk about weaknesses of George W. Bush, you're not going to start with pride. Whereas Buchanan, that's going to be his first weakness.
Yeah. Because, I mean, I think in terms of, because we talk about he's a little bit narrow in the sense that he's more or less just a pure lawyer. And also in the Grand Moff Tarkin way, where it's just enforcing imperial law. He doesn't give a fuck about the morality or the politics of it, really. It's just, here's what the law says. Here's my interpretation. It will not change. There's going to be no flexibility. But except, of course, Grand Moff Tarkin is much, much more complicated and competent, etc. But let's ignore that for now. But Buchanan, I don't think, is inherently incompetent. I think that his problem is that stubbornness, that pride, and that limitation that he doesn't recognize. Because, I mean, everybody obviously has shortfalls. Everybody also has areas they don't know that much about. No president's an expert in literally everything. But he's the one of the very few people who is unaware that he doesn't know literally everything, which is a startling thing to think about. Like, a man over 60 years old has not figured out that there are things he doesn't know.
But also, one thing, this is another one on that one, too. Think about how much success he had. Now, wait.
That's what I was getting ready to say, Sean.
He lost only one election, ever. He's got one of the best.
His resume made him stubborn. His resume made him cocky and arrogant. Perhaps that was it. Coming into the presidency. With so much experience.
In politics for decades. But, I want to add this one too, Monica. If you also look at it, when was he good? Okay, he was good in the Pennsylvania Assembly and in keeping the Pennsylvania Whig Party alive longer than it should have been. So he just succeeds at that. House of Representatives, a bit of a mixed bag. Very good in the Senate. Now, he really should have been a lawyer or just been a senator, right? If you really look at it, he was decent enough in Russia. He got that treaty, but his tenure as Secretary of State wasn't really good. And as ambassador to Britain, I would label it a failure very much. So that's a large resume, but with all that political success, I mean the electoral success. But if you really like looking at the details of it, you're like, whoa, there's a lot of red flags already showing up.
And remember, he threw his hat in for the Supreme Court.
Yeah, he probably would have been better suited to that temperamentally.
Yeah. So I mean, qualifications across the board.
Yeah.
But once again, these key failures. Anyway, go ahead, Michael.
I was going to say, so I have a question here. Like, and this is sort of a kind of a weird question, but like, was Buchanan like created effectively from sort of Southern pro-slavery ideology. As in, I feel like in some ways, like Buchanan can be so arrogant because look at how successful his friends and colleagues are and his movement is. I mean, he is effectively, a doughface of the North, strongly allied with these sort of Southern senators promoting mass mass expansion in terms of foreign policy, and pro-slavery policy. And he makes his political career in a time where, if you look, from 1830s to 1850s, it is just success after success after success for pro-slavery interests, right? You get Indian Removal Act by a total of like 4 votes, massive expansion of cotton plantations. You get a incredibly successful war against Mexico, annexation of California. And by the time Buchanan is about ready to become president, you have Americans going abroad doing filibustering, and your average American at the time would probably bet that the United States was gonna get a colony in Latin America, right?
Yeah, absolutely, yes.
Like, in some ways, Buchanan is kind of a man of his time, and in that, he's arrogant. His arrogance, his personal arrogance, almost reflects the arrogance of white Southerners at the time, right? Or at least white Southern leaders.
The Southern states, Michael, you make a good point. They received everything they asked for. Everything. They got their Fugitive Slave Act. They were able to remove natives west of the Mississippi, Oklahoma, until, of course, oil and all that was found there. Like, it wasn't one time that the Southern states did not get what they wanted, except for Lincoln. That was it. Like, everything bowed in their favor the entire time. Missouri came in as a slave state. Even with California coming in with the Compromise of 1850, they still were able to get that Fugitive Slave Act with California on paper being a free state. I say on paper because you guys kind of already know what kind of happened there covertly, but
yeah, right.
It's on paper. So it's like the Southern states got everything they wanted. They controlled everything except for that election. And then, of course, the fallout occurred.
I think they did have certain... they had some defeats, but yeah, I'd say they generally were mostly successful. Yeah, and I think Michael's right. That probably does add to the arrogance. It's like, hey, I'm allied to the winning team.
Yeah.
And Pierce is also a doughface, but Pierce's actions are best, I think, understood as narrow partisan politics, whereas I think Buchanan is maybe a bit more ideological. Yeah. Although at the same time, if Buchanan was a Southerner, remember he is a stalwart unionist, which is one of the reasons he gets, but ridiculously enough doesn't understand what actual conditional unionism means. Once again, I keep going back to him trusting Howell Cobb.
Yeah,
kind of a mistake.
But you're stuck on that. I think Buchanan was allied. It's the truth. No, I understand, Sean.
Like, that's the guy. That's the guy he hung out with the most. That was his advisor. And it was like, he was his best friend. And I'm like, your best friend betrayed you, and a bunch of other people were like, hey, I don't know if you should trust this guy.
I think that Buchanan was allied with the Southern states because they were able to manipulate him, which I'm still kind of on the fence on how they were able to do that. If he viewed himself so confidently, how was he able to be manipulated so easily? Because by time they didn't feel like he was moving in the fashion that they wanted him to, they dropped him, and went for Breckinridge. Yeah. They dropped him like a hot potato. So it's like, It's a doggy dog
Sidell,
world.
Sidell ditches him. He's like, I know you're in trouble, but I'm going to go help destroy the Union now.
Exactly. Like those aren't your friends. They never were your friends. They used you the entire time.
I think if there's ever going to be oh, go ahead.
No, he's a dumbass.
He is a dumbass. I feel like if there's ever going to, like, if there was an answer to how Southern politicians manipulated him, the evidence would be in those parties he hosted. Like,
yeah,
like I'm firmly convinced that. Like, I think in those types of parties, people might have flattered him, or I don't know what, but like that just strikes me as that's when he was convinced, oh, these guys are my friends, you know. And these guys like me and respect me. So I can lead.
Would it be safe to call Buchanan a useful idiot then?
Yes.
No, I don't think so. I think he's well, I think he is. All right. I don't think he is before 1860. I think he is at 1860 thinking guys like Cobb and Slidell are going to help him. And I mentioned Cobb and Slidell quite a bit because Cobb was a political opportunist of the first rank. Everybody knew that. And everybody knew Slidell was one of the scummiest men in America. You know, so I mean, God, there's a card, there's a board game I have where you do antebellum politics. There's actually a card that allows you to steal Louisiana because Slidell does it for you.
Wow!
Oh my God!
All right, like he has his own thief. He has his own card for stealing elections in the game.
Wait, was he the guy who helped Hayes take Louisiana in 1876?
Ooh, I don't think so. I had to look that up.
Yeah,
I don't really think so. I think he might have fallen out.
Good point, Derek. Yeah, what was that? South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana. Those 3 states.
Yeah, I mean, I want to say
no, he's dead by then. No, Slidell's dead by then.
No, he wasn't. He was alive until 1884.
Wow.
What? I no 1871.
I'll be right back.
Oh.
Yeah, dude, John Slidell was dead before then. 1871.
Slidell, I'm looking at. Okay, it was different.
Probably, man.
Maybe they're related.
Probably. I guess we'll go to super chats in a sec, but I did want to mention the John Slidell thing. Jefferson Davis, in a much smarter move, looked at Slidell and said, "I know what you are." So he sent him to France because he did have diplomatic experience, and Davis was smart enough to be like, "I'm going to get this criminal away from me."
Also, the Confederates sent a number of people who were complete idiots to their Great Lakes sabotage plan. So they had a plan to raise spies and do sabotage in the Great Lakes region. And mostly Davis
that includes Jacob Thompson.
Yeah, Davis was basically selecting people who were good for nothings because he's like, well, I'm playing with house money on this shit anyway, so as long as they're out of my way, I feel like it's a win. And then if they actually somehow accomplish something, then cool. But as long as I don't have them commanding troops or holding office down here, I guess it's a win. But I can't just tell them to go fuck off because they're connected.
Well, Thompson was also fairly crooked, and he put him. Thompson didn't like Davis, so then Thompson put himself in the orbit of Beauregard and actually served on his staff at Shiloh. His Shiloh report, by the way, is actually pretty good. It's a lot of detail in that one, but. So that was another thing. Like if Davis hates Beauregard, so he looked at Thompson. He's like, "Huh, well, you like Beauregard, right? I'm going to send you to Canada. Get your parkas out, Anyways, do you want to go ahead and do the super chats?
Sure. Let's do some super chats.
Sure. Now, before I tell you, for some reason, YouTube is not working for me, so I can't read anything.
It's the same. It's the same for me.
All right, mine is still working.
I want to ask really quickly before we did super chats because I think this is an important one. Mm-hmm. Where do we weight Buchanan as a president, or final ratings before we hear from the people?
I mean, F.
No. I mean, in terms of like, is he the worst? Is he the worst president?
Yeah, I know what you mean.
I know. In American
He's
history.
47th place.
I would put him. It's between him and President Johnson for me. It's a tough one. But if I had to, I would put President Johnson as the worst president, and then Buchanan's right above him.
Buchanan definitely takes the worst slot for me.
It's between him and Bush.
Wow, really?
Yeah, Bush would be my second worst president. So
Wow.
Johnson's
Depending on the
second
turn of
worst
time
for
of
me,
day,
easy.
man.
Wow.
I mean,
I seen that
probably
coming,
gonna.
Sean. Actually,
I hate George W. Bush with a burning
I
passion.
know.
But
I know.
I mean, like, yeah, Buchanan should have been a lawyer, and Bush should have just painted crappy paintings. Okay, so what I'm going to say is that most days I'm going to go with Buchanan.
Okay.
But sometimes but the thing about it too is that I guess that's the way I want to put this. From this vantage point right now, yes, Buchanan. But we can do worse in the next 50 years. Or people could look back on what happened in some of the presidencies we've been through and been like, that was the beginning of the end for us or something like that. And I think, Bush planted a lot of rotten seeds that are still bearing fruit.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess I'll have to go with Buchanan on that one at this point right now. Yes.
Fair enough.
Agreed. But yeah, number two, Bush, And, I mean, Pierce is in the bottom 5, but I was going to say, Pierce is a terrible president who I personally like.
yeah, I guess Andrew Johnson would probably be pretty far down. I don't know as much about him as you guys do, so I can't say too much on that.
He sucked.
His personality. He was emotional.
And then Harding is pretty damn bad and incredibly incompetent.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
And then not to stir up the pot too much, but I think Trump was probably also in that group of the bottom 5.
Oh, yeah.
Don't forget about Hoover.
Oh yeah, Hoover's bad. Oh yeah, he's bad, but I don't know if he's. Maybe.
Hoover is my guy who I actually kind of personally like, but is definitely a terrible president.
Yeah, I mean, I don't despise him as a person. It's just his presidency.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm just gonna throw out. I really do think Jackson sets the U.S. on some terrible fucking courses. I think he's atrocious.
Yeah, I'd have to be looking at my rankings again for where I'd place Jackson as far as that one goes. But I will say, you were mentioning that one about Hoover, Michael, and someone's mine is John Tyler. Because he was a failure. I'm like, he got a lot of stuff done for a guy who's supposed to be a failure. And beyond that, I mean, he did assert that, Henry Clay's like, you're going to be my puppet, right? And he's like, no, I'm the president.
Yeah. Or, I mean, you could make the same argument for Jimmy Carter in terms of a guy who's generally considered a failure, but actually has a legislative track record.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yes, definitely. No, so actually, that's the three that get low rankings that I think should be reconsidered are John Tyler, Jimmy Carter, and Chester A. Arthur. But Arthur's also one that I personally really like. I also like him. I like his presidency overall, and I really like him as a person as well. It's actually one of my personal favorite ones. Now, John Tyler, I don't actually personally like. I'm just like, guys, he got a lot done and asserted some very important things. I think a lot of the dislike of John Tyler is because historians generally like Henry Clay.
Sure.
And
and
Tyler gave Clay the bird hard.
Just in general, given how Henry Clay's status, I feel like in some ways he's kind of like the Cicero of the 19th century. Insofar as I think a lot of historians tend to see the period from his perspective in many cases.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But anyways, you guys want to go ahead and do the super chats?
Sounds good.
All right. Our first
no problem, guys.
Our first super chat comes from Chris Hoover for $2. Thank you, Chris. And he says that Buchanan is the Luigi Cadorna of the U.S. presidency, which I think is accurate.
Yeah, they both have that inflexibility, but for some reason, I get more Conrad von Hotzendorf energy myself.
You mean like somebody who is intelligent but makes terrible decisions as opposed to somebody who's just an idiot straight up?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, I get really Hotzendorf energy here, Yeah.
Fair. Yeah. I mean, I don't think either comparison is terribly flattering for Buchanan. Actually, I feel like it's more of an insult to the two generals, if anything. I mean, because at least like Cadorna took over at the last minute, had no war plans to fall back on, was not himself a good planner. So I mean, there are built-in excuses for his failure that Buchanan does not have.
Yeah, Hotzendorf, though, had dominated the Austrian military up to that point. He pushed for the war. Yeah, I think it's more like Hotzendorf. But I guess, I don't know. If I'm choosing which one's probably a worse person, probably Hotzendorf. I mean,
I know Cadorna executed more of his own soldiers than any other disciplinarian. I mean,
Yeah,
yeah.
I was reading about that.
That's same
wild.
Hotzendorf sending his troops with cardboard shoes into the Carpathian Mountains in the wintertime, too. I mean, these guys are psychos, you know?
Yeah. I mean, that's
what we got next.
All right. Michael R. for $2. Thank you, Michael. And he says, I wish I had more to give. You guys are amazing. Well, Michael, we definitely appreciate what you've given. So thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Next, we have Analogonian for $10. Thank you, Analogonian. They ask, do you know of another history YouTuber, Apostolic Majesty? Very good historian, friends with academic agent, and a confessed, serious Catholic ultra-royalist. Thank you for all the great content,
Ultra-royalist,
yeah. Somebody mentioned Apostolic Majesty in the last stream or the one before it. And I think I looked at his channel briefly.
Yeah, he's very well spoken, highly intelligent. His take on Napoleon is bad. Very bad.
Well, I mean, Napoleon did overthrow established monarchies, so how good could he have been?
Right. Well, so yeah, exactly. You know, I do think it's fun. That he's like, look, I'm an ultra royalist, so you know, like somebody like Charles X of France has a lot of negative press. I think he's the guy who's like, no, Charles X was right.
Yeah.
I think maybe I'm speaking for him though. I would say one thing I did notice though is that our live stream is mentioned in one that he did on Robert E. Lee that was very long, and I checked it out a little bit, but you know they have the chat on the side, and one person asked, "Why didn't you ask Sean Chick to do this with you instead of this the guy he had on, which is another one of these guys named Charlemagne?" And I do mention that because I was like, "Yeah, that's true," and then I was like, "Oh, that's right. Everybody's literally in echo chambers right now." So a lot of panel discussions I'm finding. And you know, this is right and left panel discussions I find. They just have a bunch of people nodding to each other and agreeing with each other.
And that's no fun.
No, it's no fun. It's no fun at all. But there's the thing is that other right-wing YouTuber Distributist actually said their Discord is dead. You know, the days of internet Discord and exchanging ideas, internet blood sports, and I'm like, he's right. He's actually one of the only people who will still talk to people I found, like, who are outside of his political thing. And a lot of the comments when he does that are, why are you talking to these, like, libtards?
Oh,
you know?
Man.
And I'm like, So yeah, but it creates something, it just creates something very, very stale. And people made, you know, we had our disagreements on the presidential one about how the campaigns were run. I think some of the comments in there were also like, you know, why you got Sean here to disagree with everybody? I'm like, I don't know. If you want to do a circle jerk, just do it, man.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost as if it's right. More entertaining and more interesting if you debate things and have different perspectives.
Yeah. I mean, I'm looking forward to our debate over the Biden presidency. I think it's going to be fascinating.
I think it,
but yeah, so Apostolic Majesty, I like him, but a lot of the discussions he does, I just find it's people nodding and agreeing with him. And I mean, his command of the information is amazing. It's very, very good command of information facts. So you'll ask him somebody will ask him a question, he'll just go on and on and on. If anybody thinks I'm long-winded on here, just listen to that guy.
Yeah,
but Apostolic Majesty once again is very, very intelligent, no doubt about that, and very well spoken. If he sometimes talks a little fast. But anyway, what's we got next?
All right, we have Mike N for $5. Thank you, Mike. He says this panel has been great. Also, let's express more disdain for the state of South Carolina. Well, thank you, Mike. And I think depending on the topic, South Carolina is frequently in for a beating. So,
yep,
it's always my punching bag.
Yeah, Monica, me too.
They've had some questionable politicians.
Burn it again, Sherman. Burn it again.
Burn it again.
Yeah.
Remember what Sherman said when he went into North Carolina? What did he say? He essentially said, "Now, guys, I want you to calm down. Now, they're not South Carolinians."
Right.
Oh God.
Well, there's also a recent true crime case. I don't remember the name, but I think it's the Murdoch case. But there's that area of South Carolina that's still run by a very literal, unreformed Good Boys network where they don't even try to hide the fact that that's what it is. And yeah, so basically, there have been a couple murders associated with the family. One of them was covered up. The other one was basically a family annihilation. And up until that happened, the local reigning judge had been each generation of the Murdoch family. So they had 3 generations in a row as the presiding judge. So
yeah, it was like the low country, wasn't it, Derek? Like
yeah, the Low Country. So basically, the area kind of like the southwest, I believe, of South Carolina. Pretty large section of the state.
Say, though,
dude took out his wife. He took out his son.
Yeah, and he might have taken out his other son if he had made it for dinner that night. So
yeah, and then I think the wife, like, she was potentially a suspect in the woman who fell down the stairs. I think she might have been the nanny to the kids. She ended up passing away also, and someone like assumed she was a part of that. Like, it was a very wicked situation. Man, that family's on demon time. Like seriously, something was really wicked about that family. Murda. Yeah, it was something crazy.
Oh
because,
yeah,
like,
they pronounce it Murda, even though it ends DOCH. But and also the guy's name was Alex, but he calls himself Alec.
Oh, they do that. They do that in South Carolina and Virginia. Like, there's this Confederate general who you think his name is Taliaferro, but it's pronounced Tolliver. Around here, Frances Parkinson Keyes, looks like Keys, but she pronounced it Keyes. She was also from Virginia, you know.
Well,
yeah, that's something they do around there, man.
Well, where my parents are from, there are 2 last names that are not how they look. There's Corrier, which is just Corriher, and then the other one that drives me crazy is Carr, spelled Kerr. So
I did want to say one thing. I know we're bashing South Carolina, but I will have to say, though, I had Kings Mountain is a very nice place to visit, and I had a great little vacation in Charleston. Excellent food, some of the best I've had in America. A lot coming from the New Orleans guy, and the beach is cool too. So I will, you know, those are good parts about South Carolina.
And the harbor's great as well. I mean, I remember I did a harbor cruise the one time I was in Charleston, and I saw a dolphin, which I did not expect. I had no idea there were dolphins in that harbor, but apparently it's full of them. So
yeah, it's a pretty place.
Oh yeah, no, actually, walking along the beach, the dolphins were like 5-6 feet away from the shore. I mean, they come right up.
Yeah,
you know.
So it's
dolphins love Charleston.
Yeah, no. Apparently, there's a lot of food getting dropped in the harbor, so I guess it comes from the beach most likely. Anyway,
what do we got next?
We have Jonathan Mays for $49.99, which is a hell of a donation. Thank you, Jonathan. He said, "Finished a job and wanted to thank you for your dedication to history, brother. Keep up the good work, and I'd love to see a video essay on anything to do with ancient Mesopotamia. I love your mofo video style, efficient, entertaining. Stay safe, Papa bless." Well, thank you, Jonathan.
Yeah, he said brother. He said brother. I heard Hulk Hogan, man.
Yeah, brother. And then there's a surfer hand sign. Yeah, I am thinking about doing some stuff on Mesopotamia at some point. I don't know exactly how deep I'll go into it, because I do have some lectures that I've assembled for class before that would work for like a general overview. One thing I am planning on doing next year, though, is taking the lectures I've been working on this year for the History of Britain class and doing a history of Britain from the beginning until the present.
Oh, that's
nice.
I do want to say on that, man, if you want to do a live stream on ancient Mesopotamia, I'd be down with that, because still my favorite live stream we did was Persia. It was the Persian Empire.
Yeah,
that'd be cool.
Yeah, we can definitely do that. My concern with Mesopotamia is that it is a massive subject because of the time covered in it. But
maybe narrow it down.
Yeah.
Between this and this, part 1 and then part 2.
Yes. So that is something that I will definitely plan to do at some point.
Yeah.
Now my thing's messing up, but luckily I can still see the last 3, so I guess we can
Oh,
finish.
Good.
So we got Sir Fatty for £2.50 or £2.50. I'm not sure how you say that properly, but thank you nonetheless, Sir Fatty. And there's no comment there. We have Mike N for $2. Thank you, Mike. And he says, also do an episode on the state of Louisiana. Well,
Yeah.
that could also be multiple parts, probably, depending on what we focus on.
Yeah, I could.
That would be pretty nice.
I could do that.
Yeah, no,
Yeah, you guys should. That'd be fun.
That would be a lot of fun.
Yeah, one idea I also
Or-
have that's related to that a little bit, because obviously with Louisiana there'd be a lot of corruption stuff to talk about. It might be fun to do a Grant administration deep dive, but that one might need to be 2 parts, like one for Reconstruction and normal policy, and the other one for just corruption.
Man, I'm in on Grant. Let's do it.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, yeah, I mean, once you get down into like the different states and Reconstruction policies and the way the federal government, like what choices they're making in different states, it's very interesting, actually. I think, and I know, Sean, you think that sort of like the recent scholarship on Grant is like way too kind to him. And I will say this: you look at some of the later Reconstruction policies, and I can kind of agree with you a little bit. Like, I don't know, his intervention in Brooks-Baxter War has serious problems. And so I would love to get into those nitty-gritty details. That'd be fun.
Yeah, no, I on the other one, I remember someone at one point said like do a Grover Cleveland one. I'm like, I don't know if I want to like hurt myself, but
yeah, I guess another one we'll have to do at some point is another one we got to do at some point is Woodrow Wilson, because I think he's the most controversial American president according to the YouTube history community.
Oh yeah, I think that would be good.
Remember, despised by all factions.
Yep.
They got that meme where it's like Arnold and Carl Weathers and Predator like doing like that, joining hands. He's like, Dylan, you son of a bitch, right? We could do that meme applies to Woodrow Wilson's presidency.
Yeah.
Like you got people who disagree on almost everything but we both agree Wilson sucks.
Oh yeah, they might have extremely different motivations and reasons, but they do agree that Wilson was bad.
Wilson and Grant, I think will make great.
There's one. I would actually, I guess the one I would do, since I mentioned the John Tyler thing, and kind of make him a case, is I'd do a John Tyler one.
Yeah, Tyler would be interesting.
Here's my case. This thing about Tyler is that my case isn't like he's a great president. I'm just like, no, he's totally not incompetent. He is not. So I'd make a case that he's more of a middling, maybe above average president. So I'd do that one.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yep.
All right. Next up, we have Ultra Maximus for 1999. Thank you, Ultra Maximus. He says, Thersites, you are the light at the end of the tunnel. Thanks for making my college experience much more bearable with your channel. Well, I appreciate that, Ultra Maximus, and thank you for your donation. Fine. Congratulations on finishing college, if that's a recent achievement.
Congratulations.
Let's see. So I know there's another one that just came in, but I'm having trouble finding it. I saw something light up to tell me that it came in, but here it is. All right. Arjun Jairaj for $5. Thank you, Arjun. He says, I can't believe I missed you guys' stream for Gladiator 2. Movie sucked.
I heard it was bad, man.
Well, everything Ridley Scott does these days is shit, so.
Well, it's said that when Ridley Scott makes a movie, the gods flip a coin.
Yeah, I think at this point, Ridley Scott is the James Buchanan of directors, because apparently he takes zero feedback from anyone on set. No matter how brilliant the actors or writers he might have around him are, he doesn't give a fuck what anyone else thinks. The movie's going to be his vision 100% of the way. There will be no pushback because he is a genius.
You know what's interesting about that too? Interesting about that too is that probably his most broadly well-regarded movie is Alien, and that's the one that he's the most collaborative on.
Huh?
It's just kind of like George Lucas when he was more willing to make compromises in Empire Strikes Back, and that was his best film.
Right.
Yeah, and also Ridley Scott was a little more uncompromising on Blade Runner, but yeah, he wasn't like that necessarily. He was hard to work with, but he was listening to people. But damn, had the mighty have fallen.
Yeah, I mean, his Napoleon movie was abysmal.
I was about to say, did you guys watch Napoleon? I
did.
could not actually sit through the whole part of that movie.
It was decent. I appreciated it.
Really? I'm
okay.
surprised.
I mean,
it was just okay.
I sat through it because I paid for it, but the thing that got me though was his portrayal of Napoleon as like a manic depressive who like had random mood swings for no reason, but yet he's supposed to be a charismatic and inspiring leader. That part of it was really off-putting, and also the fact that he fired one of his cannons and hit the pyramids. Not only did that not happen, but that is something that Napoleon absolutely would have hung somebody for doing, because he was a history buff. The part about like him examining the mummy, I thought that was fine because I can imagine him doing something like that because he is that kind of person who'd be interested in that. But for the most part, I think it was just tonally all over the place. It was a portrayal of Napoleon where they didn't really have an idea of who this guy is as a person. The only way you can make it work in editing would be this. What you need to do is play up the fact that obviously Joaquin Phoenix looked like a 50-year-old man throughout the movie. This was about the age Napoleon was when he died. And make it where he's on his deathbed at St. Helena and he's having flashbacks to his past. That way when people see him as their contemporary rather than as he is now, it makes sense that they ignore the fact that he has less charisma than James Buchanan.
Right.
And, it's just like him seeing himself in the past, and therefore, like, the other people actually acting like normal people makes more sense because they are not perceiving what he's perceiving. So it kind of makes the shitty acting and direction decisions all work out. So you can actually fix that movie in editing.
That's brilliant. Yeah, because I was horrified. Like,
you should have been a consultant on that movie.
Seriously.
I mean, Ridley Scott is an auteur. He does not require any advice from me.
Well, all right.
But that was just such a horrifying depiction of Napoleon. I mean, just one of the most inaccurate depictions of a historical figure I think I have ever seen, actually.
Oh, wow,
it's bad.
I ignored it because I heard the negative reviews, and then I was like, "That's right, he's British." So,
yeah.
Because guess what? Apostolic Majesty, he's British too. British people they love hating Napoleon.
See, I think you need to watch the Napoleon movie though, Sean. I would love to hear your feedback on it. Actually, the next time the audience hates on you for whatever, that could be your punishment, your penance. Could be watching Napoleon. And doing a reaction stream to Napoleon and Gladiator 2.
I was about to say, I think a reaction stream to Napoleon is like, I don't know. I think it could work quite well. There's a lot to lampoon about that movie.
Yeah, there's a lot.
I'm also, Michael, my mind's churning about which movies have I seen that have like wildly. Oh, you know what? It's a really bad one. I've seen they've made 3 movies about Hitler in the bunker shooting himself, right? And the one with Alec Guinness, that is the worst depiction of Hitler ever. He's just ranting, raving, and screaming, and I'm like, that was him in speech mode, not him like hanging out with his secretaries, okay? The ones they did with Anthony Hopkins, The Bunker, that was a little boring, a little slow but good. And then, of course, there's Downfall, which is excellent, right? But that's actually one of the most inaccurate. Is Alec Guinness playing Hitler? That's not very good.
No.
I don't. I'm not sure if it was Alec. I'm not sure if Alec Guinness, because he's a great actor. I'm not sure if he was just given bad direction or if Alec Guinness just screwed it up himself, because every actor's got a bad day.
Right. No, I don't know. Good question.
Yeah, you can't. That one was bad. That was bad.
Yeah, because actually, I'm to give Ridley Scott's Napoleon credit for like one thing. There was one scene that I enjoyed, and that's that scene where there's disturbance while he's trying to become first consul, and then he gets roughed up by the crowd, falls down some stairs, and then he eventually makes it in and says, "So, shall we vote?" After his troops have already seized, Parliament.
Yeah,
that scene's good. The rest of the movie can suck it.
All right, wait, real quick, guys. I've got it. I remember another really inaccurate one, but I like the movie a lot, is the Mutiny on the Bounty from the 1930s. Their depiction of Captain Bligh is a joke. I mean, historically speaking. It's a great performance as a villain, though. But if you want to see what Captain Bligh... A better, more accurate portrayal of Captain Bligh is Anthony Hopkins in The Bounty from 1984. Charles Lawton as Captain Bligh. He is great as a villain, but it is a terrible, terrible depiction of history. Yeah.
Very cool.
But I guess you could do a stream on that. I could actually do a stream on that, man. I'm kind of obsessed with the Mutiny on the Bounty.
Really? Okay.
But anyway. Yeah, like I've read a few books on it. Every once in a while, I get back into it. Then I found out that the replica of the Bounty sank off the coast of North Carolina, and one of the people who died on the boat was Fletcher Christian's descendant.
No way.
Yeah. Apparently, when people get on the boat, she'd be like, "Hi, I'm descended from Fletcher Christian, the guy who stole this thing." She introduced herself that way, Anyway, what we got next?
That's it so far as I can tell, unless unless it's just not showing me. But right now,
wait, it's showing for me now, so I've got two more.
Yeah, there are two more. Okay, I found them. Right. Pablo Avila for $10. Thank you, Pablo. Have there been any significant discoveries in regards to the Mycenaean Greek civilization in the past few years that are worth discussing? Thank you for all the fun discussions. I have not kept up much with Mycenaean or Bronze Age archaeology, to be honest. I have heard a little bit about more findings on the Minoans on the island that blew up, Santorini. So that was once a major Minoan center. The person who's taken over the site is very much pushing the idea that it was, in fact, a matriarchal society, and that they had a possibly monotheistic religion around a central goddess, based on the findings of some goddess statues and things like that. In terms of the Mycenaeans, though, I haven't heard anything in particular about them. But I haven't taught archaeology in a few years, so I need to probably brush up on the latest and greatest findings. I know in general, at least in Egypt, the pandemic was actually a really good opportunity for archaeologists because of the lack of tourists. So maybe that's true for the Greek world as well. I have to look into that. But thank you for your question. And then we have Jack L for $5. Thank you, Jack. And he has a quote: "Thank the stars for James Buchanan," attributed to Franklin Pierce.
That's pretty good.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of like how I imagine George W. Bush probably breathed a sigh of relief when Trump got elected. He's like, well, everybody will hate him now.
Well, just also, of course, what does Franklin Pierce say when he's not renominated?
I don't recall.
There is nothing left to do but get drunk.
That could be a good name for a memoir for him, or a biography.
No, it's my favorite presidential quotation of all time. There is nothing left to do but get drunk.
Well, that would be interesting.
I'm imagining like a very drunk Franklin Pierce looks at newspapers and says, "Thank the stars for James Buchanan," and then lifts that whiskey up to the lips.
Yeah.
Pretty good.
Maybe he's got like his whiskey glass already out, and then he goes, "Here's to you, bud."
Oh, Lordy.
right.
Yeah, I would like to read if there is a book on the relationship between him and Hawthorne. That'd be fascinating to me because I also love The Scarlet Letter. It's a great novel.
Yeah.
Anyways,
I'm sure it's
I just think, and I also kind of want to read. Hawthorne wrote a campaign biography for Pierce. Kind of want to look at that too. Of course, the second best Pierce story, is what happens in the Battle of Contreras. Remember that one? So what happens is Beauregard and Lee map out the path to attack the Mexican army. They take them by surprise. The Battle of Contreras lasts probably an hour at most, more like 30 minutes. Pierce is on his horse and yells, "Charge!" The pommel of the horse hits him in the balls. So he falls off the horse, holding his crotch, screaming, as his men charge to victory.
Oh, man.
Rough day.
So again, he fights in the second battle that day, which I can never pronounce the name. It's like Churchabasso or something. It means place of the war god. And Pierce, essentially hobbling along, goes up to Scott and he's like, "I've got to get into this battle." And Scott's like, "I heard you were hurt." And he's like, "I need to really prove myself right now."
Man,
Anyway, that's it.
Damn. All right.
Oh yeah. Well, that's also one of my favorite live streams every day was the Franklin Pierce one.
Yeah, I don't recall a lot of the details from that one. It's been a while since we did Pierce.
Anyways, but I read the Michael Holt biography, and he's just one of the best historians. But anyway, we got anything else?
Yeah, we just got one a second ago from Mark Benevento for $9.99. Thank you, Mark. You guys are great. I'm a truck driver, and your videos keep me going. Their CITES as Roman videos have me learning the lives of probably every Roman politician who ever lived. Thank you, guys. Well, thank you, Mark, and keep on trucking.
Thank you, Mark. Keep on trucking. What's that Sawyer Brown song about truck drivers? It's an old school song from the 90s, I think.
I know the one for Grateful Dead.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's that one.
Thank
and then
you,
there's
truck drivers.
Convoy.
You
There's
keep
Convoy. But yeah,
keep us going.
Yeah.
Well,
I don't know
guess.
that. Convoy?
Yeah. I guess that's it, guys.
Yeah,
that's all there is.
Sounds good. Well, that's actually pretty good timing.
Just like the Buchanan presidency, it has ended.
James saw and did nothing. No.
Well, you had one, Derek, where you ended this video, and it made me and my then girlfriend die laughing. Where at the end of the video, you're like, "And now he's gone, and now we can move on and have a drink." you were like, it was. I think it was a Byzantine emperor one. The way you ended it was just perfect comedic timing. I've played it for a few other people, and everybody dies laughing.
Yeah, I mean, I just probably was afraid I'd fuck it up and have to start re-recording, so I just wanted to end it as quickly as possible. And I'm like, so that's how a lot of those.
You're really unimpressed with the guy, whoever it was. So you were like, "Yep, he's gone now, and I'm happy."
Yeah, I mean, most of those guys weren't that impressive, if we're being honest. Most of those emperors were a bit underwhelming. Actually, the guy I'm working on now, Constantine IX, not the most inspiring person.
Oh man,
Right.
I can't wait.
Yeah, the Emperor of Gout. But anyway, so I guess he is in a polyamorous relationship, though. I guess that's kind of interesting.
Okay,
I guess
something.
Yeah.
Well,
all right.
Yeah. Yeah. Something, man. Something. Well, yeah. I'm just gonna. I think I'll have a drink and go out, and yeah. So, all right, guys. It's been. Thank you all for coming on, and very good to meet you, Monica.
Enjoy New Orleans.
All right. Well,
every night.
Thank everybody for coming in, and thank you for tuning in. And I guess we'll just call it a night. So, good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night. Good night.